Tonight, on History So It Doesn't Repeat, we feature an interview in a movie, speaking with author Larken Rose in premiering a director's cut of his new film. We'll discover why it is happening here and what we can do about it. Learning's the answer. What's the question? It's all coming up on History So It Doesn't Repeat.
Welcome back to History So It Doesn't Repeat. I'm your host and navigator, Richard Grove, and tonight we're going to engage in an interview with former political prisoner and current author and filmmaker, Larken Rose, to ask the questions which lead to understanding why it can happen here, why it has happened here, and what we can do about it happening here. But first, we must define it, and that's where we're going to need the assistance of our guest. Larken, welcome back to History. I screened your submission to the InfoWars Operation Paul Revere contest a couple hours after you put it up. I thought it was a remarkable film, and I wanted to invite you here and give you the platform tonight to give us a little bit of the context and the how-to of creating something like this. Would you mind spending a few moments talking about how you created your first documentary film and why you entered the contest?
Well, I spent about a month frantically working around the clock, finishing a video project, a rather huge video project, called It Can't Happen Here, which just posted on April 30th.
Okay, so that's the topic of the conversation today is It Can't Happen Here, a new documentary film crafted by Larken Rose in the month of what, April? You did it in 30 days?
Yeah, it may have been a little bit shorter than that. I had the idea for the project before I heard of Alex Jones and InfoWars doing a video contest. It wasn't nearly going to be the production it ended up as, but I thought, hey, this sort of fits with what it sounds like he's looking for, so what the heck, I'll go all out and not sleep for a month and see if I can get it done.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the InfoWars project, Operation Paul Revere. It was a film contest, and why did you see fit to invest 4 weeks of your time into meeting a April 30th deadline and adhering to all these rules? What grabbed your interest? You had an idea. What took you from the idea that you had in your head and actually getting it to action?
Well, Alex Jones was having this contest, Operation Paul Revere, basically, as in Paul Revere riding around saying, the British are coming. Basically, how do you alert people to what's happening in the country and what to do about it? And I was already thinking of a video about people's misperception of what tyranny is and how it happens, and their tendency to imagine that somehow it can't happen here. There's some magic spell on this piece of dirt where it can't possibly happen here. And I was already thinking of making that video, and it seemed to fit so well with the theme of what the contest was about and as Alex Jones described it. And I thought, okay, I'm going to try to actually make a full production of this. Now, to begin with, I was thinking maybe 30 or 40 minutes. And the thing ended up feature length because I kept thinking of things and thinking, yeah, I have to put that in, and I have to put that in. It actually would have been 2 hours if I didn't go through and hack out everything that I thought was expendable. Because it's a huge issue, and there's so many little pieces that fit together into a big puzzle of comprehending what tyranny is and why it happens, that I didn't want to shortchange it. I didn't want to leave out any pieces. So it ended up a lot bigger project than I had intended for it to be. And I believe I got it uploaded about an hour before the deadline hit on midnight on April 30th. So a little close, but made it.
Well, that's what deadlines are for. They kind of force the congealing of those thoughts into something formidable and the uploading of it so it doesn't drag on forever. Because as a filmmaker, you could keep adding and adding to it or refining it down, or there's so much to say. So that brings me to my next question. What has happened in America since the founding fathers and Paul Revere riding around saying the British are coming and people being able to take informed action to today, where it's not as simple as saying the British are coming? you actually have to, have to put a lot more substance with the message and almost share how you came to those conclusions before you can share that conclusion and take action. So could you comment on, what's so much different today that you have to actually make a documentary film as opposed to just go around with a megaphone and let people know, that terrorism is being constructed by artificial means instead of what they're telling us on TV?
Right. I guess the equivalent back then would be the British are coming and let me explain to you why that's not a good thing. Because it's so much about the mentality and the philosophy of the people. That is what allows for tyranny, or it's what prevents tyranny. But in this country, just as in Germany and Russia and China and everywhere else, the people feel patriotism and they feel good about their country and they think, yeah, it's great here. Yeah, there are things to complain about, but everything's generally okay and we're generally a great country. And that's what Americans think. And they don't, because they're not aware of philosophy, they're not aware of history, they're not aware of how these other tyrannies that everybody now points to and says, that was horrible, they're not aware of how they come about. And so the purpose of this video was to show that the mentality that allows for tyranny, it's not like some tyrant just snuck in when nobody was looking and all you have to do is point out, hey, he's a bad guy, and everybody goes, oh, okay, let's get rid of him. It doesn't, as the video points out, the tyrants almost always come to power surrounded by, adoring masses and cheering throngs, so happy to fall for the message of the tyrant because they don't know it's the message of a tyrant. They think it's a savior come to fix everything. And that's always how it goes. And I think Americans have this sort of oversimplified view of like there's good guys and the bad guys wear a hat that says bad guy on it. And as long as it doesn't say bad guy on the hat, you don't have to worry. And history shows that's obviously not the case. And so it really is a matter of fixing people's perceptions and their philosophy and their mindset, because as the video says, you can't force tyranny on a people that understands freedom. But a people that doesn't understand freedom, you don't even have to force it on them. They beg for it and they demand it and they cheer for it. And unfortunately, America has gone in the direction where a lot of Americans are literally out there cheering for tyranny and don't even know it.
So you're talking about the connections between the loss of philosophy and the learning of to love our servitude, really. And so this tyranny that you're describing is almost, filling a vacuum created by people who can't tell fact from fiction. And when you can't tell fact from fiction, you'll just believe a good story. How does that connect the loving of the servitude and the absence of a philosophy to find truth?
Right. Whenever somebody has a slave mentality, when they don't want to be responsible for themselves, and that describes a lot of people a lot of the time, they'd rather someone come along and say, you don't have to worry, you don't have to figure out anything, you don't have to come up with a solution, you don't have to be responsible, you just do as you're told, and I, the authority, will make everything okay. And that's what every tyrant in history has done. And whether it works or not, the rhetoric's always the same. Whether it works or not depends on the listener. And whether the listener is okay with the idea of, yeah, I'll give away my freedom, and I'll give away my responsibility, and I'll give away the idea that maybe I should be fixing things and maybe making the world better is my job. I'll give that all away for the promise that somebody will take care of me if I'll just be subservient to him. So that's the mindset that has to fix. Because again, if a tyrant comes along and does the exact same rhetoric to a people that understands and loves freedom, they all just go, no thanks, and nothing happens. Like, you can't get into power without at least a large portion of the people thinking it's a good idea to give you power.
Well, obviously, you're speaking from a position of experience and having a lot of knowledge on this subject, but let's get to the creation of something new through a documentary film medium. What kind of imagination did you have to use? How did you have to use your imagination, in fact, to get started to apply your experience and your knowledge to be able to communicate across this mysterious void with the audience?
Well, the biggest challenge was, in a lot of projects, this among many others, is getting people to see reality from a different angle, from a different viewpoint. And really the overall goal of this video project was to take an American out of the role of an American and just be, okay, you're just a person looking at history to see what's gone wrong, why it went wrong, how to have it not go wrong again, and basically show them the world not as they're taught it is as an American, growing up in an American school with American teachers, with an American media and an American government telling them, here's what America is, but taking them to an objective vantage point and saying, okay, let's look at that thing as America, not as your country, what you should be blindly loyal to, but just examine it actually objectively in the context of world history and all these other powers and what's been happening for thousands of years. And so it's sort of, the challenge was making Americans able to look at America anew, as if, without all the assumptions that have been pounded into their heads, all the indoctrination, and just show them the facts. And I made it a point, there's a zillion different issues and conspiracy theories and false flag operations that people can get into, and Alex Jones gets into a lot of them. Some I agree with and some I don't. But I made it a point with this video, there's nothing in it factually that's at all debatable. I didn't get into who did 9/11 and who did this. It's all just undisputed history, and a lot of it is quoting directly from the tyrants, because you can learn a lot by watching what people, in retrospect, we know they're nasty tyrants. Mao and Stalin and Hitler, we know they did nasty, horrible things. So now we can look back and say, well, what did they say to win people over and make the people think it was a good idea to give them tons of power? And if you walk an American through that, they start to notice similarities like, wow, that sounds a whole lot like what comes out of the White House, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican there. And so it was basically the challenge was painting a picture that isn't hugely tainted by somebody's nationality. In this case, it focuses mainly on the United States, but hopefully it'll be, anybody in the world can look at it and get an objective view of reality and history and philosophy and why tyranny happens, and come face to face with the reality that first is really scary. My favorite thing to hear about is people saying, wow, that sort of creeped me out, but it also made me feel a little bit empowered that we really can do something if we understand differently and behave differently. But gosh, we better do it, because we're headed down the same road that all those other countries have gone down, and what's at the end of that road is not pleasant. So it's just a challenge of giving people a different view of reality, really just an objective view of reality, instead of the indoctrinated, cleaned up version of nationalistic indoctrination.
Well, let's dig for a moment into how to give people a more comprehensive perspective as you did. Let's talk about how you structured the film and its form and function. What specifically did you have in mind when you laid out? There's obviously a lot of information. How did you judge between what was substantial and unassailable, in my opinion, and that, dismiss that which was arbitrary and would have made the movie even longer? I think there's a lot expressed in an hour and a half. Some people would have to watch it many more times than once. I had to watch it at least twice to really, it's not that I'm not familiar with these topics, but each time I watch something, I can learn, a little bit more, because you have time to pay attention to different aspects of the film. So just talk for a couple moments about the form and function, how you structured it to be able to communicate across this knowledge gap, in such a way that people can really realize the hope that exists, but they do have to do a little learning first.
Right. In any, when I actually carefully make a video instead of just me ranting at a camera, I always want it to be as concentrated as I can, not pointlessly redundant. And I would rather have it that there's so much information that people can't digest it all and want to go through it again, like you were saying. And if there's anything, basically I do the test because I'll write down a million little notes of things that could be in it. And then every line in the script and every this, I think, if I take that out, will it really matter to the overall message and point? And if not, even if it's something interesting and fascinating, if it doesn't actually, if the main point doesn't suffer from taking it out, then I try to take it out. Because there's so much stuff that is crucial and essential to really getting a full understanding that, like I said, I just barely got it down to an hour and a half when it started as a half-hour project. And I particularly like to do things that people haven't heard of before. I mean, there's a lot in the video that a lot of people in the freedom movement, or whatever you want to call it, will be familiar with, but I think there's a bunch of stuff in there they won't be. One of the main ones that I only became aware of probably within a year were the constitutions of the Soviet Union and Red China and the Weimar Republic, that out of which the Nazi Empire grew. And I didn't realize how similar their constitutions were to ours. And they have like the equivalent of a Bill of Rights, and it sounds so nice and pleasant. And so I think that was one of the important things for me, is to get in information that's, again, it's indisputable. Nobody's pretending their constitutions didn't say that. But I'd never heard it, and Americans aren't taught this, and most Americans never hear it, and put together the pieces that everybody knows. You know, everybody knows a little bit about World War II, and yeah, Nazi Germany was bad, and then put in a bunch more pieces that they may not be aware of, to just systematically paint a picture that you just kind of can't get away from the conclusion, and just basically make a trap. Like, here's the picture. What other conclusion is there to reach?
Well, I think when you connect so many dots in such a credible way, you can't help but see what the picture is. And the only reason we haven't all seen the picture before is, as you mentioned, the education system in America has been corrupted. It specifically was corrupted with the Prussian education system, which was developed in the Weimar Republic of Leipzig, because I don't think Leipzig was in Prussia, but they call it the Prussian education system, which is very clever. But you should check into it. Wilhelm Wundt, everyone in the audience, I'm sure, if you haven't heard of his name, you'll be very interested when you find out what he did and how you've been schooled to believe that these things don't exist. So I noticed in your presentation, in this first documentary venture that you've so brilliantly constructed, that you didn't use a lot of appeals to emotion or rhetoric about how great America is. Rather, you depended on facts and objective knowledge and perspectives that have been, until now, disclosed, veiled, occulted, if you will, hidden from the American public. And it's only by screening these other pieces of contextual information put together by individuals like yourself that we can all broaden our horizons and actually come to understand these fragments of history we've been presented with as a coherent picture and actually take some meaning from that picture. So what is the meaning that you're drawing out through it can't happen here, even though it is and is going on, and it can be prevented here too? What are the themes of tyranny that you're using to illustrate, and what's the point in illustrating these different tyrannies that have gone on through history?
Well, again, the main point is to have people's minds escape the trap that allows tyranny. Because again, if the people aren't in the mindset that makes them susceptible to falling for tyrannical propaganda, then they're in good shape. Like I said, you can't force tyranny on a people that actually loves freedom, but if you can dupe them into giving up their freedom for something that sounds pleasant, then you can rule the world and stomp on people and commit mass murder. And so emotions, I don't at all mind emotions, but when trying to reach an understanding of the world, emotions are not the way to go. So even when I feel emotional about, frustrated or depressed or angry about just mass atrocities, just almost unimaginable, I try to keep it just factual. Here is what happened. Now, I could scream and holler about how horrible that is, but I'm pretty sure most viewers know that it's horrible when you murder 10 million innocent people. So I don't really feel like I have to tell them to feel bad about that. But walking through the reality of how tyrannies grow, what the tyrants say, what the people think, what they fall for, why they fall for it, why it sounds nice, one of the main focuses is collectivism. And collectivism is always the philosophy. I don't even know if it's worth calling a philosophy, the mutated, demented version of philosophy behind all tyrants, whether they're labeled far left or far right or anything else. Always they rely on the collectivist philosophy. And the video gets into this more, but basically collectivism teaches that the individual doesn't really matter. The common good is what matters. So if stomping on you serves the common good, well, then we're going to stomp on you, and you should be happy about being stomped on because it's for the nation and the people and the common good and yada, yada, yada. And that's what tyrants always use, because you can't just come along and tell people, I want to control you and stomp on you and boss you around and take your money. They don't go for it unless you can say, if you'll only give up, you're so benevolent and virtuous that you're willing to give up some of your freedom and your property, we can together make a great and prosperous, yada, 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 collective authoritarian design. That sales pitch is necessary for tyranny, because you can't go to good people and say, give me your freedom just because I want it. You have to give them some lame excuse why giving up their freedom will somehow serve humanity. So every tyrant uses that sales pitch. And you can see it, you can see it in Hitler's speeches and Stalin and Mao, and the video has a bunch of quotes from them. And you can see it in the speeches of American politicians. It's the same underlying thing, because whenever somebody wants power over you, they can't just say, I want power over you because I kind of like dominating people. They have to convince you that you being free is a bad thing. Because whenever they get power, you lose a piece of your freedom. So to trick you into giving up your freedom, they have to convince you through fear, or saying, we could have this great thing if only you're willing to give this up. If you're not so selfish that you want to be free, but if you're willing to give it up, we can make this great centralized plan of a utopia. And to see the mindset, to see how these tyrants function, and to learn how to recognize, because they all sound nice. Tyrants don't come out sounding nasty. They sound like, we're going to save this country and make things great. So people have to know what to look for, because they do use emotions. Tyrants always use emotions, fear and sadness and joy and hope, and to dupe people into giving up their freedom. And once people understand, which I hope this video will give them that understanding, once they understand how tyranny comes about, because the details change, the overall template is always the same. A guy comes along and says, if you give me your freedom and let me have power over you, I'll make everything great. And then everything gets really horrible. But the reason people fall for it is because the sales pitch sounds persuasive. You can have free stuff and you'll be protected and yada, yada, yada. And so showing people how to recognize, how to see through the rhetoric of tyrants and see, here's one of the things the video does, is it goes through a list. If the guy in power is doing these things, it doesn't matter what he's saying, he's a tyrant. And bad things are going to come, no matter how lovely his master plan sounds. If he's doing those things on the list, bad things are going to happen. They always do. And so when people can look through the emotional garbage that's put on top to make it sound pleasant, and see the literal reality and recognize the patterns of what always leads to tyranny, then hopefully they can say, yeah, we're not going to fall for that this time.
Well, it's about outgrowing the status quo, as you're mentioning, because tyranny is playing upon your fear, which is an emotion. And emotion is how you feel about what you think you know about the world. But if what you're calling knowledge is actually not reflective of objective reality, then those fears can be used against you. And fear, which is a survival complex in our body, innate to our natural human beingness, can be used against us. And so when our actions get put in conflict with our needs to survive, we should all take a step back and say, what is this break with reality that we're experiencing, whether it's through public schooling or corporate media or corporate films that they're putting out? Because there's a lot of propaganda documentary films that are out there, but I don't see people taking a practical application like we actually need to inform our friends, family, neighbors, everybody of what we're noticing. And what we're noticing is an incremental trend toward tyranny on a scale that we've never experienced in history, but we have some pretty awful examples to look at to see how it's trending and where it's going. I mean, Russia with the Gulag Archipelago, they never had the technology of Facebook and the smart grid that's going to connect everything together in your house. I mean, they just had a stool pigeon next door who listened to your conversation if you left your window open. Now we're infecting our entire environment with devices that are basically, you know, imperial probe droids, as Alex would say.
Right. And the technology it's a double-edged sword. It can be a huge help to tyrants, or it can be a huge help to people who want to be free. And again, it depends entirely on the mentality and the philosophy of the people. People who are like, oh, yeah, you can monitor me if it makes me safer, and you can keep track of me, and you can, you know, spy on my emails because, golly, there are some nasty people out there. You better spy on everybody to find the nasty people. If they have that mentality, then technology is really darn scary. But if they have the mentality of freedom and self-ownership, technology is awesome, because it means we can keep an eye on all the people trying to control us, and we can communicate ideas like we're doing right now in a way that you just couldn't do if you lived in Nazi Germany. You know, you write out some leaflets and throw a few around and then get your head lopped off. Like now we have the internet and we can spread it to hundreds of thousands of people. And so far, neither of us have had our heads lopped off yet. And so, technology, it all depends on the mentality of the people, whether it's a really bad thing or a really good thing. By itself, it can be either one.
Well, I think the mentality of most people is a state of mental slavery where they're not thinking for themselves. And this absence of philosophy, a method to find truth, if you will, has created a vacuum which is filled by apathy, and it's apathy that's fueling the tyranny. I mean, these are just some ideas that I picked up from watching your film, but am I on the right track? Is that what you're picking up on as well?
Yeah. And whenever, I mean, the underlying sales pitch of tyranny is always, you shouldn't be free. You can't be trusted. There are things out there that you can't defend against. You can't take care of yourself, you or your neighbors. You can't take care of each other. There are all these bad things in the world, whether it's, you know, criminals or foreign invading armies or poverty or economic troubles. You know, the tyrants will focus on different things, but it's always be scared of that and be so scared of that that you decide it's not worth being free, because freedom leads to uncertainty. So give me power and I'll save you from all those nasty things in the world. And it's totally, to have somebody fall for that, they have to feel physically and mentally dependent, like they're ill-equipped to understand the world, to understand what's going on, to know what to do about anything. They have to feel helpless and inferior so that they want some big master to come along and save them. Because if they feel self-reliant and they feel informed and they feel free and they feel able to do things on their own and interact with people they know and do things on a voluntary basis, if everything's going fine, what's a tyrant going to do? You know, he comes along and says, everything's going fine, but give me your freedom anyway. It doesn't work. They have to say, things are going to be really bad if you don't give me freedom. And the only way to do that is to dupe people into a state where they don't know how to take care of themselves and they don't know how to take care of each other, or at least they think they don't know how. And so tyrants will often just make up, sometimes they'll focus on an actual problem, but sometimes they'll just make up some big scary boogeyman that we're supposed to be so terrified of that we need a monstrously huge government to protect us from, because us peasants couldn't possibly defend ourselves from fill in the blank, you know, whatever the bad thing the tyrant wants us to be scared of. And so, ignorance and fear is always what they're trying to push into people's heads. And understanding and responsibility and self-reliance, not every man for himself, but we can take care of ourselves and each other just fine without a master. That is what tyrants are most scared of, is that mindset, which is why they're constantly trying to do away with that. The Prussian indoctrination system, and it's everywhere in the media, it's in the education system, it's in every speech every politician ever makes, you should be scared and hide in your basement while we save the day. We just saw a ridiculous example of that in Boston, and people cheering for it. Hooray, we got treated like cattle, which is just depressing. But it's totally a, to get a little cliche, it's totally a battle for the hearts and minds of the people, and ultimately that's all that matters. And so that's what the video focuses on. The conclusion isn't, so elect this guy. It's, you need to have a real understanding of reality and a philosophy that matches your moral code, where everything fits together and allows for an actual rational moral society. Because if you're feeling scared and helpless, you're just waiting to get stomped on by a tyrant who promises to save you from reality.
I always say useful knowledge is the end of ignorant bliss. And if they're taking away systematically our self-reliance, our self-esteem, our self-confidence, that sounds like it's a war against the individual. And so let's talk for a moment about this concept of democide. It's done by an authority called the state. Could you at least define it for the audience, and let's talk about its history for a moment?
Well, basically democide is death by government. And in particular, death by people's own government. And not only does government murder completely dwarf private murder, statistically speaking. There are bad people out there who just kill other people on their own, but government does it to a monstrously huge level. But not only is there war, but even the deaths created by state manufactured war are dwarfed by governments killing their own people. So even governments killing the people of other countries is small compared to them killing their own people. And in the last 100 years, the numbers are just astronomical. It's hard to even get an exact count, but it's somewhere probably over 270 million human beings killed by their own governments, not counting war. And statistically, compared to private murder, if people actually understood the reality, they wouldn't say, well, we need a government to protect us from some murderer who might be out in the streets. No, we don't need the guy who murders 50 times as often to have lots of power to protect us from the little tiny murderer. But people are unaware of these statistics. Hopefully they'll be a little more aware if they watch the video. But the idea that people can be tricked into thinking government is a protector and is needed to protect their person and their property, it just amazes me how many people fall for that. And I have to admit, I fell for it for a lot of my life. I was a statist. I believed in government for a lot of my life. But looking at it objectively, it's really a weird thing that anybody believes it, because what you're basically saying is, well, there are people out there who would harm you and your property or enslave you and take your property. So what we need to protect you is a giant organization that has societal permission to enslave you and take your property, as if that will help. And we'll call it government. And hopefully it'll steal a bunch of your property, and it'll use what it steals from you to protect you from other people who might steal your property. And of course, that's not how they phrase it, but that's the literal reality of a tax-funded protector government, which also does a crummy job of even protecting from the private criminals. But the legalized theft always dwarfs the private theft. But people still fall for it. And in any category of crime, kidnapping, theft, murder, assault, if you look at the amount done by private individuals and the amount done by government, it's never even close. And yet people still are scared to death of the idea of not having this giant, violently aggressive parasite around to protect them. And that's a testament to how well the indoctrination, statist indoctrination has worked.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about why so many people support democide and support things like the martial law that happened during the Boston bombings. I mean, 1 million people were on lockdown because one suspect, a 19-year-old kid, was on the loose, and they searched every house except the house with the boat, and the suspect was, recovered because a guy went out for a smoke, not because Boston had spent $3 billion or whatever their budget was for all those mega army vehicles that are being used not overseas. I don't even agree with them being used overseas on other human beings, but I especially don't like the fact that everybody is unwittingly contributing to an ever-growing escalation toward a police state, and they think it's all great, and they cheer USA, USA, and people who ask legitimate questions about things that were reported and bring up these contradictions are demonized in the mainstream media, even though there are facts and there is journalism to be done, and it's not being done. And as independent journalists and researchers, it's our job to pay attention and ask these questions and to, cast off the ridicule and dismiss it as arbitrary, because the people that are ridiculing us are intellectually bankrupt. So what do you think about the fact that they locked up 1 million people and said you can't go outside, and if you went outside, they would point guns at you, and then the media would tell people that wasn't going on. They didn't point guns at any innocent civilians. They didn't break anyone's civil rights or amendments weren't dissolved, voluntarily or involuntarily. Can you talk a little bit about what you witnessed during the making of the film?
Right. And the Boston thing actually happened pretty late on in the narration doesn't talk about that specific event, but some of the footage from it is in there because it makes a perfect example of some of the points that were already in the script. But it's just another example of how they use fear to drown out people's ability to think rationally. I mean, it's if you look at it objectively, if you're huddled in thinking, oh, there's some scary guy out there, somebody save me, and then you applaud when, somebody shows up, it's completely driven by fear. But if you step back a second and think, the entire thing was just ridiculous. I mean, a thing I pointed out in the different video is if you're in charge of the police in Boston and there's 1 or 2 guys out there running around, we want to find them, about the stupidest thing you could possibly do is get a giant Humvee that says police on it and cover it with heavily armed guys and drive around. Like the guy's going to stand out and go, oh, darn it, you caught me. Like you can sneak up on somebody in a Humvee. They didn't do it to catch those people. And I'm not even going to get into what actually happened because I don't nearly buy the official story, any of the 20 different variations that have come out. But aside from what actually happened, what they're telling people is, well, there's 1 or 2 people on the loose. There was 2 and then there was 1 because the first one died. And to do this just martial law everywhere and Humvees driving around and basically the military marching up and down the street, that's just tactically stupid if you're looking for one person. And yeah, they found it because somebody said, hey, look, there's somebody in my boat. Yeah, everybody else could have just stayed at home until the guy checked in his boat. But they did it to see if people would put up with it. And the only reason they did is because fear was outranking the ability to think in their heads. And the big media, the media's out there telling you, be scared, be scared, be scared. Shelter in place, because if you step outside your house, it's the end of the world. And one of the saddest things to me is, and maybe people say this, it wouldn't make it to the mainstream media even if they did, the people in power are giving this message that says there are terrorists everywhere, there are scary criminals everywhere, the world's a dangerous place, and by the way, you shouldn't have guns. In Boston, would that not be the perfect example of the time when normal people should have guns? But Massachusetts, good luck being able to legally own a gun. So they're out there telling people everything's dangerous and horrible, but you should not have the means to defend yourself. And if we catch you with the means to defend yourself, we're going to put you in a cage. And I don't hear tons of people out there saying, yeah, well, how come you disarmed us and then you told us to hide in the corner while a bunch of jackboots, stormed around for however many days? It's just a ridiculously contradictory message. And the only reason people fall for it is when fear is just drowning out their rational thought.
Well, and I think there's also a deeper irony because it happened on, Patriots Day. It happened in Massachusetts. When you go into the origins of Lexington and Concord and the shot heard around the world, it was over the British are already here and they're disarming us or attempting to disarm us. And here's, hundreds of years later, here's another scenario because history repeats until we, take time to learn from it. And so what I'm hearing from you is that the fear, confusion, this uncertainty is being leveraged by government because there's an absence of philosophy or how to find self-reliance, self-confidence, self-esteem through finding knowledge of that which exists. And in the absence of that process, which we all should have gotten through school, we seek a higher authority, somebody to tell us what to do, someone to say they're going to protect us, that we're going to be okay. And if we just send them a little bit more money, they can make sure it doesn't happen next time, whether it's Benghazi or the SEAL Team 6 families coming out and announcing that the government lied to them about the death of their family members, or any of these other circumstances where evidence of the crime scene is purposely obscured. All sorts of protocols and procedures are broken. The forensic epistemology of the events does not match the stories being purveyed, and the mainstream media is more guilty of conveying conflicting information, knowing that it is not true. So they're the ones purveying the conspiracy theories. We're out here left to ask the questions, to try to find the answers, and to apply philosophy as a means to finding some knowledge. How can you comment on that situation? Because I just find it too ironic to even continue on without saying some curse word.
Right. To me, it's always funny that the people in power want us to be terrified. And whenever somebody points at the people in power and says, maybe they're part of the problem, whether it's, actually saying maybe they wanted this to happen or maybe they caused that to happen, but maybe even if things happen the way they said, that just some random person decided to be nasty, it benefits them to have power over us. And when that's labeled as a conspiracy theory, that again is completely driven by fear. Because if you're feeling ignorant and helpless and hiding in a corner, and somebody tells you that the big savior who's coming to save the day and catch the bad guy, he's your worst enemy and he's the biggest threat to you, you don't want to hear that. It's like hearing that your all-time hero is going to come in and save the day, and he comes in and you find out he's the worst guy around and he's there to beat the tar out of you. And so people actively resist considering anything other than the authoritarian approved version of what's going on because they're literally too scared to consider the possibility that maybe the people in power don't want what's best for us. They don't want to protect us. They want to enslave us. They want us scared. They want us, hurt. They want the economy falling apart. They want bad things to happen to us. And an example of that I use in the video, It Can't Happen Here, is Operation Northwoods, because that's not a debatable. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's a conspiracy in the government's own words. And their declassified documents, there's nothing debatable about it. It's funny because ABC reported it. They came out and they reported Operation Northwoods, I think it was 4 or 5 months before 9/11, 2001, and never mentioned it again.
Well, I think the source for that is James Bamford's Body of Secrets, which was published in 2001 as a book. He's an ex-NSA worker, I believe, and he also did another book on the NSA. So, yeah, it's been reported in mainstream news once, and then they never act like that happened again. They're just like, we reported it once, and that's what independent journalism's about. It's not that these stories aren't being published. I mean, what Alex Jones talks about every day are the stories being published by other news outlets, and what he offers as far as opinion and analysis, well, that can hit or miss. That's the messenger, but the message is consistent. There are these documents being generated all over the place that have validity, and you're not being shown these documents on mainstream news, so it's left to independent journalists, filmmakers, radio show hosts to kind of bring these things together and at least inspire people, provoke your thinking and get you talking about these things so you can find out for yourself what is actually going on, because that's what we're doing. We don't know. We have to ask questions to find out.
And that's the reason I focus on Operation Northwoods is it's such a perfect example of why doesn't everybody in the country know the term Operation Northwoods because the documents are publicly available. Literally takes 2 minutes to download the scans of the actual declassified documents from anywhere in the world, anywhere that has internet. The only reason everybody doesn't know it is because it's something they don't want to know. I mean, it's indisputable. It's easily accessible to everybody. The mainstream media even admitted it and then sort of quietly forgot about it. But the only reason everybody doesn't know that is because they don't want to. It's too scary a thing to think about that. And I won't get into the details, but for those who don't know, I should at least say it's the government openly discussing carrying out false flag terrorism, including on U.S. soil, to get the American public to support, the latest war. In that case, it was war with Cuba. We're going to do terrorist acts. We're going to blame it on Fidel Castro, and then we're going to go invade Cuba. And the documents are very blunt about it. Yeah, we can blow up a ship. We can blow up this thing. We can sink a refugee boat coming up from Cuba. We can do all these nasty things. We can do a terror campaign in Miami or maybe even in Washington. I mean, he's talking about it openly and openly says that the goal is to trick the American people into supporting a war with Cuba. And so there's nothing hidden. There is no theory involved. But I know a lot of people read that and they just don't want to let their brains process it. And that's the fear getting in the way. Because if you have undisputed evidence right in front of you and you don't dare to let your brain digest it, that shows that you really are deeply enslaved mentally.
Well, I think that's just when people are attached to the blissful ignorance, and sometimes they just need another adjacent fact, because a naysayer would say, well, Operation Northwoods may have a lot of things that resemble what happened on 9/11, but they never carried out Operation Northwoods. And I would retort, there's an Academy Award-winning documentary by filmmaker Errol Morris called Fog of War, in which the past Defense Secretary Robert McNamara admits that a false flag attack was carried out to start a war with Vietnam. And so there is a case of false flag strategy being put into action. It's not the exact same as Operation Northwood, but you can see where the Northwoods document lent itself to credibility in the mind of the military masters who were carrying these things out. And when you have a sycophantic so-called investigative journalist in the mainstream body of people who they don't ask any questions and they report the government statements as their own stories, that's how things can happen. That's how millions of people can be fooled into going to war with a country that we had no conflict with. That's how tens of thousands of kids in this country got sent to die and everyone approved and thought it was a great idea. And we're left to either pass on this legacy and turn our heads and pretend it's not happening, or to take our time and invest the energy into sifting through these ideas. So what were the mindset? Let's compare and contrast what's going on now to the mindset of the founding fathers, insofar as, were the founding fathers afraid of people in this country having the right to free speech or bearing arms or any of these other rights that were memorialized in the Constitution under the Bill of Rights and further amendments? Were they scared of people having individual rights, or are these individual rights not only natural law, but necessary to the existence of a free country?
Well, I would start by saying that there was actually a conflict back then and ever since then between different individuals. The anti-federalists were already more on the side of individual freedom than the federalists, so there were debates about that. But as far as the people being armed, both sides said, well, yeah, of course the people get to be armed, and of course the people get to say what they think of government. There was a lot of common ground between Federalists and Anti-Federalists at the founding of the country that said, yeah, of course, government doesn't get to take your property without due process, without law. It can't be arbitrary, and they can't just assume you're a criminal and treat you like a criminal unless they actually have evidence enough to get a warrant, to get some neutral judge to say, yeah, we think there's actually reason to believe that this guy did something bad. Now you can go seize this or search that or whatever. And so even just in the common ground, because there were lots of little debates going on, or big debates going on, actually, but there was a lot of common ground, and it showed up in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, where they openly talked about the fact that, yeah, the people, they should be armed. They should outgun their own government, because the alternative is their own government outguns them, which does not lead to good things. And so they were very open about that. And it's it's again a testament to the indoctrination that so many Americans wave flags and say hooray for Washington and Jefferson. But first of all, they don't even know what those people said. They don't know what they did, good or bad, in either direction. And when they're going yay on July 4th, they have no idea the principles that were actually talked about then. You know, the debates between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, the entire spectrum was extreme radical anti-government by today's standards. Like the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were in that little sliver that's now, oh, that's radical and extreme. But people, because they don't know philosophy and they don't know the basic principles, they just sort of think, oh yeah, they were great guys who did something or other. We got independent from England or something, and they don't know how to compare concepts. They don't bother to check. One thing the video mentions, that right now under our constitutional democratic republic, there's basically no way in which we're not way less free than we ever were under the rule of a king. King George III never did anywhere near what Congress does, what both parties do all the time in terms of taxation and regulation and control. But because people don't get the underlying principles, which the video gets into those underlying principles, well, what actually are they? What was different about the United States? And that's really the theme about it, because people sort of imagine, yay, we're the United States, we're number one, we're the greatest country in the world. But if you ask them, well, why? What's different about the United States than other countries? Most Americans just get this stupid look on their face. They have no idea. And the one thing that actually did sort of make it different, which was the very individualist philosophy, especially from people like Jefferson and Patrick Henry and Thomas Paine, that's just gone out of the minds of most Americans. They don't even, it's not even that they decided to get rid of it. They never knew it existed. They don't even know that that's what started the country. And they're out there cheering for what started Soviet Russia and Red China, thinking these are American values. Healthcare is a human right. I was like, that's not Jefferson, that's Chairman Mao. But they don't know, and they don't know history, and they don't know philosophy. So they're still waving their American flags and saying yay, yay, yay for Washington and Jefferson, and contradicting everything those guys said.
Larken, America is number one in prison population.
Yeah,
you know, right? I mean, when I saw that, I was like, yeah, we're all taught growing up that our country's the best, America's number one, and you're not realizing that everyone in every other country that's kind of led itself into tyranny is told the same thing. And so when you really step back and it's like, what are we doing really well in this country? Well, we have people that produce immaculate forms of propaganda using billions of dollars of technology and equipment and multitudes of resources to make people believe things that are not true, to create unrealities in the mind. Why? Because it tricks you into making the wrong decisions, and that gives other people power when you sacrifice your own intellectual cognitive abilities, when you become a stimulus reaction functionary to their words, because that's all it is. It's people using words to control other people. Have you found something different in any of these cultures that you present, that you set forth in your documentary?
No, well, there are minor differences, but the underlying thing is always that. It's always mind control, because body control requires mind control. And even in the example of slavery, open slavery, that was called slavery, it was more often than not, the slaves thought they were supposed to be slaves, thought that that's what it is. I only recently came across a great quote. I probably would have put it in the video if I hadn't heard about it only 2 weeks ago. I think it's Harriet Tubman, who basically said she worked with the Underground Railroad sneaking slaves out. And she said, this is almost a direct quote, "I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if only they had known they were slaves." And that is exactly what America is now, is trying to get people to want freedom. And they say, well, we're already free. We already have freedom, and we love freedom. And yay, look, I can wave my flag. And they don't even know what it means. And they don't know that, as you said, all those tyrannies pitch the exact same thing. We're free. There are quotes in the video of like Joseph Stalin saying, no, we built this empire so people could feel really free, not to violate individual liberty. And but Americans don't know because they aren't taught the evolution of those other tyrannical empires. Because if they were, they'd say, wow, that looks a whole lot like what we have. It sounds like it. It looks like it. It's following the same path. So they can do what the people of those other countries do, which is wave their flags and feel good and, yay, we're great, our country's great, while they just happily stampede into totalitarianism without even knowing it and denying it all the way, every step of the way. No, there are exceptions here and there where bad things happen, but basically we're free and great and yay. And they have no objective measure of freedom versus tyranny. So literally they cheer for slavery and call it freedom.
Well, I really like the Harriet Tubman quote, I freed 1,000 slaves and I could have freed 1,000 more had they known that they were slaves. I think that John Taylor Gatto could relate to that because there's so many people that just don't even get why you should look at. I mean, I didn't look into this for years. I knew about Gatto's work. I didn't see how it was relevant to my own research. And then when I discovered, oh, it all fits together, I was blown away. I want to cut to a short clip with John Taylor Gatto talking about pragmatism, specifically the Harvard brand of pragmatism, the philosophy that allows truth to be whatever strong people say it is. We'll be right back.
The most important figure, though, is not known to many people. He's perhaps the last major philosopher human history has produced. It's pronounced Piers, but it's spelled as if it were Pierce. Charles S. Pierce, a strange figure, a part-time lecturer at Harvard, created the pragmatic philosophy that William James was probably the chief distributor of. But your key man's Pierce because he's much less, how would I put it? He's much more direct than James. James comes from a long intellectual tradition, a genteel tradition, and in a sense, James knows just what to say in every situation. Pierce said that truth and justice flatly do not exist. This was picked up, by the way, by Oliver Wendell Holmes, who then said truth and justice are what the strongest members of society say they are, and any sane judge decides a case before he hears the arguments, because you don't want to rattle the framework of society. I mean, this is big time radicalism. Of course, they didn't see it that way at all. They saw it as nitty-gritty truth, and all these superstitious, sentimental additions had occluded the fact justice is what strong people say it is, truth is same thing.
So that's an evolution of Kantian philosophy where they remove cause and effect, and then their irrationality can be rationalized.
Yes.
After looking at what John Taylor Gatto had to say, Larken, is there such a thing as objective truth? And if people forget or try to deny that, what sort of things happen in the world as a function of pragmatism or solipsism?
First of all, yes, there is such thing as objective truth. Sometimes it's a challenge to figure out what it is, but the idea that there isn't really such thing as truth is, to me, it really is insane. And I don't really buy that anybody really believes that. You know, they may play their life, they may play other people and manipulate other people as if there's no such thing as reality and true and false. But if you, for example, if one of these people says, oh, there's no such thing as true and false, there's just opinions and practicality and pragmatism. If they go to a store and say, oh, I want that $5 sandwich, here's a 10, and the guy says, okay, here's your dollar and change, and they say, well, you owe me 5. No, no, no. You think that 10 minus 5 is 5, but I think that 10 minus 5 is 1. So, neither of us are really right. It's just a matter of opinion. Nobody really thinks that way. But some people, I think, pretend to think that way when it serves their own power and it serves their own agenda. And basically, they're just obsessive liars, and they want to pretend that's a philosophy, that they don't want to have to be attached to anything real, any evidence. They don't want their spin and their approach to have to match objective reality, so they just pretend there isn't one. And it really is just insane and horribly dangerous, because if you can convince yourself that there's no true and false, there's no right and wrong, there is basically, you'll do anything that you think might benefit yourself. It really is the philosophy of sociopaths, that I don't care what happens to anybody else. Nothing else matters but me getting what I want. And that's, you can call it a philosophy if you want, but
I think it's the absence of philosophy. I think if you don't have a structured philosophy, if you don't have a method to understand what knowledge exists and how to find it, and to dissipate the fear and uncertainty with this method used consistently, you're going to end up not knowing, and you don't know which way is up. And I think that's where a lot of people are being taken advantage of, because a couple of colleagues of mine, Brett Venant and James Corbett, had a discussion called "Logic is Not Enough." And the fact is, we all communicate using logic, but we also need that creative inspiration. We need to be able to have these dialogues or dialectics within our own mind, questioning as a process of asking questions to find knowledge. And so it's this inconsistency in the application of logic and reason that I think is at the root cause of tyranny. And I agree with your observation. I don't think these people believe that there is no truth in their own personal lives. I think that's a story they conveniently spin to the public, hoping that people just believe it. And if you examine the lives of these people who argue from a solipsistic or a pragmatic angle, where they say truth and justice is whatever the authority says it is, you would find numerous contradictions. And so you'd find out that either they don't understand these contradictions, or they're purposely deceiving you. Either way, they shouldn't be a source of knowledge for you. It should be someone maybe you listen to, but you have to listen by asking questions in your head and seeking substantial answers. And I think it's the breaking up of that process that creates this vacuum where people don't have any idea. If you go out on the street and ask them about how is philosophy necessary in your life and how do you use it daily, they would look at you like you're some guy from Mars. That's a crazy question. How dare you ask me a question like that? But in fact, reason is how we all survive in this world. And it's when they break up, our ability to reason from reality, or they purposely obscure it by saying, hey, don't look over here, look over here. I think that's a source of control and one of the sources of tyranny. What do you think?
Yeah, and it reminds me of the fact that, rational thinking people can reach different conclusions about things and have honest disagreements. But when somebody doesn't care, like they're not trying to find the truth, and they even admit they're not trying to find the truth, they're just saying and doing whatever serves whatever they want to get for themselves, that's a very different situation. Like if you and I could be, I'm sure if we tried hard enough, we could think of something that we disagree about and have a rational discussion where we're both trying to find the truth. But if somebody comes on and their goal is to manipulate and deceive you to serve some end they have, it's not working together. It's not a common goal. It's a conflict. It's a battle. And the people who say there's no such thing as objective reality and whatever the biggest guy says is true, those are just people literally trying to rule the world. They don't care. They don't care what's true and what's false. They don't care what's right and what's wrong. They're just parasites. I mean, the sociopaths and the pathological liars who will say and do anything if they think it benefits themselves. It's something that I think most of us, I'm actually in the middle of making another video about that, about the fact that normal people can't relate to sociopaths. And that gives the sociopaths a huge advantage over the normal people, because normal people we can't lie that well, because we care if we're not telling the truth. We know there's truth and there's true and there's false. And if we're lying to somebody, we feel bad about it. Sociopaths don't. And so they can lie and just right to somebody's face and look completely sincere especially when they're running for office, which is what sociopaths love to do. And the voters will just think, well, nobody could sound that sincere and not mean it. But this is what happens when somebody has no loyalty to the truth, where they just don't care what it is. I don't at all believe it's because they think there isn't such thing as the truth. I think it's just they don't care what it is. All they care is what benefits them. And dealing with somebody like that, yeah, you got to really be on your toes and don't fall for the idea that, well, they have their opinion, we have ours, and we both want the same things. They don't. They want to rule the world. Somebody who has that disdain for truth is an enemy of the truth and is an enemy of reality. And that's not a good thing for anybody except maybe him if he pulls it off.
Well, you've stumbled upon the observation that politics is war by other means. That type of war is war by deception or psychological warfare. So my observation has been that the fact that people don't care is proof that they're being controlled by sociopaths. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you, when, like the examples we were using before, Boston, there's a bunch of other ones, when somebody demonstrates that they all the way don't want to know something about the truth, that's a dead giveaway that somebody basically has puppet strings going into their brain, that they will actually actively resist understanding something, not just because, well, I'm not interested in that, but when they try not to know things. And this comes up fairly often in conversations with people where they just say, well, I don't really want to know if that's true. And, there's some pretty unpleasant things about the world that I could kind of sympathize in one sense of, I don't want to know every bit of evil going on the planet because it would be horrendously depressing. But when people actively, like, I just want to do my job and get my paycheck, I don't want to know what's happening with the world, that's a dead giveaway that they were trained to be that way. Because that ignorant bliss, first of all, the bliss is always temporary. The whole thing of ignorance is bliss. Right now it might be bliss, but it leads to something that is not bliss. And so it's not even in their own best interest to remain ignorant, even if they try to remain ignorant. And so when people act that way, it's because they were trained to act that way. It's because people who wanted power over them tricked them into the mindset of, I don't even want to know, somebody else will take care of it. And that's the only way you get to be a tyrant, is to trick people into saying, you take care of it. You have the power. You have the responsibility. You have the control. And just take care of me so I don't have to worry about those things. And that's, when somebody exhibits that, it's a dead giveaway that hey, the tyrannical propaganda worked on you.
So you're observing that condemnation without observation, it's the epitome of ignorance. And why are people across the board, not just random individuals, but massive herds of people acting in a stimulus response type of non-thinking? It's an avoidance of thinking purposely, because in between stimulus and response, there's your thinking, and that thinking allows you freedom. That's your space. And you don't give that space to other people, and you don't let people make that space non-existent by having stimulus reaction. So we're entrained to think that ignorance is bliss. We're entrained to think that philosophy has no value. Who could be doing this to us, and how do they benefit from doing it to us?
Well, it was very nice of them when they were building the Prussian indoctrination system to openly say what it was for. Now we pretend that our public education system is to teach the children what they need to know to be yada, yada, yada. When the system was built, they said, well, we want to make a bunch of easily controlled people, especially when it comes to the military. When we tell them to go kill somebody, we want them to do it. We don't want them thinking about stuff and having a conscience and all that. And what's unfortunate is they basically took the same system and put some, nice icing on top and said, now it's suddenly good. The same structure, but now it's to help you. The schools are to help you and teach you. So that's a conspiracy that, to begin with, they were very open about it, because the peasantry was kind of easily, malleable to begin with. But now they covered over the lie, even though you can look it up, John Taylor Gatto does a bunch of stuff on it, and a bunch of other people do too. You can look up the Prussian indoctrination system and learn a lot about it and what it was designed to do, and compare it to modern Western schools, and you'll see, wow, that's the exact same thing with the exact same result. And it really is. It isn't just like a lot of people think that, well, our education system doesn't work too well. It works marvelously at what it was supposed to do. It doesn't work too well at teaching people to think, because that's not what it's for. In fact, it's to teach people not to think. And in debates and discussions, which I have all the time with people about issues, it's scary to me how many Americans really, I would say, they can't think. I don't just mean they're kind of bad at it. I don't just mean it as a generic insult, oh, you don't know how to think. I all the way mean they can't think. They don't grasp the concept of if this, then this. They can't follow a train of thought. It's just sort of random, fluffy, vague, emotional stuff that comes flying out of their head with no connection to each other. There's no coherent anything underneath. And it's really creepy. And as soon as I realize I'm talking to somebody like that, I'm done.
It's almost like
go anywhere. It's just going to be creepy.
It's almost like whereas reality is made out of these different puzzle pieces, and when you discover enough, they fit together. The school system, the mainstream media, they just cut all the parts, the edges off. They make a circular puzzle piece, and so none of these circles seem to go, like, they don't fit together anymore. They've cut off the edges that help you make those connections. So noticing that we've been having the liberty, the self-reliance, self-esteem, self-confidence bred out of us through the schooling system. And at one point we had a beef with this other country called Britain, but now we're allies with them and we're joined up with them in foreign policy and all these sort of things. And my question will be, is the British government a noble and worthy ally of the American people?
No. In fact, you could exchange British for any other word in the world. Government is never a noble ally of decent people or morality or the truth. But in the case of England, as my video, It Can't Happen Here, it gets into the fact that we view other countries by whether our ruling class is buddies with that ruling class. And it's funny, the example of Great Britain, because they're the ones we declared independence from and had a war with. I say we in the sort of group thing that I don't even believe in, but just for shorthand. But now they're good guys, and we like them because they're our allies and they're noble and righteous, and never mind all that imperialism around the world and enslaving and stomping on people all over the place. That doesn't really matter. And so people are trained to think in terms of groups, like they're on our side, they're on the other side, to have this, and that's a huge tool for tyrants. And it comes up in a bunch of different places in the video, that if you can get people to think there's our side and there's their side, and we're the good guys, and anybody on our side, if they do something bad, you kind of look the other way, or you say, well, that's unfortunate, but they're worse. And if you can get people into that mentality, then as a tyrant, if you can get your subjects to view some other group as them, they're the ones we don't like, they're the ones we hate, so we can attack them and we can murder their civilians and it'll be righteous and we can do all sorts of things. So there's our friends and our enemies, to make it like a football game or something. If you can get people to think in those simplistic terms, they put up with a huge amount of tyranny. And you can see that in the propaganda of Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia and Red China and the United States. They all play that game. And in fact, there's a Hitler quote in the video that's basically, the art of leadership consists of consolidating the attention of your people on one perceived adversary and have nothing mess with that one focus. That's the bad thing over there. And we will do anything to defeat it. We'll give up our own freedom to our masters. We'll act like monsters. We'll murder civilians. That enemy, that us versus them is all that matters. And that's a trick that's been used forever, and it's used here just like it's used anywhere else. And people are trained well enough that they don't recognize it. They think, well, we really are the good guys. They just thought they were the good guys because they were indoctrinated, but we really are. And golly gee, if you go ask them, they'll say the exact same thing. Well, you Americans, you're indoctrinated, you're evil imperialists, but we are the good guys. And it keeps working because people can't objectively stand back and say, they're doing exactly to us what Hitler did to Germany and what Stalin did to Russia. And it's the same template over and over again.
And what you're describing is, what you can refer to as a dumb portrayal of good and evil, where they create these caricatures, these epistemological cartoons. In the current 21st century, that cartoon would be Muslim terrorists. And we're supposed to all be scared and give up our liberties and give up our privacy so that we can be more secure here. But when you get into the origins of Muslim terrorism, you find British MI6, people like St. John or St. John Philby, father of Kim Philby, who was a famous communist spy and traitor to America. So there's all these interesting historical connections that lead you back to an Anglo-American establishment of financiers and people who have been trying to change the values, the thoughts, the attitudes of Americans. And they've done it incrementally because they're an empire, and the empire never forgets, and they got plenty of time to work on this. And they've got a lot of interesting allies, whether it's the Jesuits in the Vatican or Freemasons or any of these other groups. They all agree that they want to suppress consciousness, and they wage war against people who try to express consciousness. That's the only war that's gone on through history. It continues to be waged, and I think Larken and I are just looking for a few more people to realize that it's going on, and you can participate on either side you want, but you should at least have an informed decision and think about it and think about what you're doing in your life. Because if you're being apathetic, if you don't care about these topics, then you're fully under the control of the other side that we're trying to at least speak out against, because what they do through our non-thinking is, and our apathy, is get us to dehumanize other people, to allocate important resources that should be used in this country to go and destroy innocent people in another country. So, in an effort to bring this interview to a crescendo so we can launch into the actual film, is it logical to assume that we can ever gain security through sacrificing our liberties?
No. In fact, even just understanding the question shows how ridiculous it is. Because to give away our freedom is to give away control of ourselves and our property and our lives. And the idea that we have to give that away in order to protect that the question doesn't even make any sense. But people look at it like, I'm willing to give up some of my freedoms if it will mean, like, what? Why would you give up some of yourself in order to protect yourself? It doesn't, never mind that it doesn't work in practical terms. Even theoretically, it's insane. Government is never good because government is always about one person's forcibly subjugating somebody else. You don't get to freedom and justice by one person forcibly subjugating somebody else. The good news is that most of the people on the other side, the statists, aren't there because they're evil or nasty. Like the video talks about, all the people cheering for Hitler and for Stalin and Mao, they didn't do that because they were evil. And they didn't do it because they were malicious. They did it because they didn't understand the truth. They didn't understand reality, and they were duped into falling for the propaganda of tyrants. So the good news is, I mean, if that many people were genuinely malicious, we're just doomed. I'm just going to run off and live in the hills. But the vast majority of people aren't. It's just that they've been deceived, which means if they can be enlightened, if they can be shown the truth, if they can be convinced to dare to think for themselves and dare to want the responsibility that comes with freedom and understanding and being in charge of themselves, if they can be convinced to give up the mental and physical dependency on a master, on an authority, and say, yeah, I'll be in charge of my life, they're our allies instantly. Because they were never malicious. They weren't trying to be bad. They were just duped by a gigantic lie. And I think the people in power know that they're starting to lose that battle big time. I mean, they have a lot of puppet strings and a lot of heads, but they're losing a lot by the thousands these days of people who are daring to think about it and realizing, wow, I was cheering for bad guys. Oops, well, I won't do that anymore. And I'm one of them. I cheer for bad guys. I was a statist for many years. And so all we need is for people to wake up. We don't have to make evil people into good people because good luck doing that. We just have to have people convinced to have the courage to accept ownership of themselves, is what it comes down to. And when they do that and they start to think, most people demonstrate they're pretty good at being human beings, rational, moral human beings. But they have to escape the mental chains that the tyrannical propaganda have smashed into their heads.
Is there any way that America can be free if individuals are losing their individual freedoms? What relationship do individual freedoms have to the overall nation of America and its state of liberty or non-liberty?
The only kind of freedom there is, the only kind of right there is individual. And the idea that somehow it can benefit the collective to hurt all the individuals, to restrict the freedom of every single individual will somehow help the group, is just a ridiculous lie. And it's a lie that tyrants always use. And unfortunately, people are because they believe in authority, because they believe in government, most people fall for the trick that says, hey, if you give me power, I'll go tax those people you don't like, and I'll go regulate those people you don't like, and I'll pass laws to make people be what you want them to be. And so people think, well, I should be free, but that guy shouldn't be because he does things I don't like. And one of the main conclusions of the video is that doesn't ever work. It doesn't work in real life, and it doesn't even work as a concept. You have to want freedom for every individual on the planet if you're going to have it for yourself. And there's a Frederick Douglass quote, anyone who would put a chain about the ankle of his fellow man will sooner or later find the other end fastened to his own neck. And that is true. We either choose freedom for everybody or we get slavery for everybody. There's no such thing as I'm going to be free, but you should be controlled. It doesn't work that way. And people have to learn that.
Is it possible to end tyranny without resistance, or is tyranny a function of non-resistance?
It's impossible to end tyranny without resistance, but the resistance doesn't necessarily have to be forceful. In fact, the best way is when the resistance is just ignoring them, which is sort of a weird thing to call resistance, but disobedience. The only thing that ever ends tyranny is disobedience. And for that to happen, the people have to understand that they are not beholden to the tyrants who claim the right to rule, and that it's perfectly moral and justified. As the Declaration of Independence says, if that government is destructive of individual rights, it's not just your right to get rid of it, it's your duty to get rid of it. And most Americans don't have that mindset. But yeah, the mindset of the ability to disobey is the only thing that stops tyranny. And the disobedience may be, violent revolution. It may be Gandhi just disobeying and you can beat me up, but there's a billion of us, so good luck. But whatever manifestation there is, or if everybody wakes up at once, it's just ignore them and they have no power. But underlying all of those solutions is people have to understand they are not somebody else's property. They are not beholden to the control freaks in the world who call themselves government and lawmakers and use their fun terminology to pretend they have the right to rule us. When that lie falls away, then people are capable of disobeying. And regardless of the specific way they choose to disobey, that is the path to freedom, and there isn't another one. And the video gets into the fact that voting and whining and begging politicians and petitioning, that doesn't get to freedom. The only thing that gets to freedom is individuals understanding that they are free. They were born to be free. They should always be free. And anybody who claims the right to rule is lying.
Well, here's to taking one small step for ourselves and one giant leap for liberty. And with that being said, it's my privilege and honor to present you with a masterpiece of independent media, one man's energy harnessed through the medium of cinema, ready to empower countless individuals with the knowledge that instills self-confidence, self-reliance, and self-esteem. Without the freedom of the individual, there is no freedom. Here's Larken's submission to the InfoWars Operation Paul Revere contest. It's his first documentary, and if we're lucky, it won't be his last. I'll leave you with, it can't happen here. And once again, I thank you for tuning in and not dropping out.
Communist China under Mao Zedong, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler. Throughout history, authoritarian regimes have inflicted oppression, extortion, enslavement, terrorism, torture, and murder upon innocent people. Many Americans firmly believe and confidently proclaim that such a thing could never happen in the United States. But is this just wishful thinking? Or is there something fundamentally different about the United States that renders it immune to the tyrannical oppression that has plagued every other major empire in history? The first step in analyzing the claim that it can't happen here is to identify and define what it is. Many people have an oversimplified, almost comic book type view of tyranny, an image of the obviously malicious dictator wringing his hands while cackling maniacally about ruling the world. In the real world, tyranny has always come about under the guise of defending the nation, protecting the people, and creating law and order. To gain power, a tyrant, at least to begin with, needs the support of the people. A successful tyrant cannot openly exhibit malice and lust for power, but must craft his message so as to convince the people that his intentions are noble, that he wants truth and justice to prevail, and that the way to make that happen is to give him power and control. Authoritarian regimes grow by exploiting people's fears, worries about economic troubles, crime, foreign invaders, and so on, and convincing the people that the solution is for a political leader to be given total control so he can protect the people from the evils of the world. This is always the template out of which tyranny grows. No matter how repressive or brutal a regime becomes, those in power will continue to claim good intentions, and will insist that extraordinary government powers are necessary to protect the people and to create justice and order. Throughout history, every time humanity has taken a step away from freedom and towards tyranny, it was done in the name of serving and protecting the nation and the people. But because every candidate, every political party, every regime claims to be for peace and freedom, for truth and justice, for protecting the innocent and defeating the wicked, how can the potential tyrants be recognized and kept out of power? Every tyrant claims to have noble motives, insists that the people should trust him, and promises to use his power for good. Finding the truth, therefore, requires one to look past a politician's words and to focus instead on his actions. There are several basic philosophical principles which tyrants always seek to undermine and destroy. In any country, determining whether these principles are being respected or violated indicates whether that country is headed towards tyranny, or is already there. Historically speaking, it is a relatively new concept to suggest that there are limits to what rulers may do to their people. The Magna Carta 800 years ago expressed the radical idea that even the king should be subject to certain restrictions. Subsequent English law and later the U.S. Constitution specifically described certain things that those in power can never have the right to do. Several examples of this are found in the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, collectively known as the Bill of Rights. This would include freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, freedom from being forced to testify against oneself, the right to be armed, the right of an accused to a trial by a jury of his peers, and so on. The Bill of Rights did not claim to create any of these rights, but instead identified such rights as inherent to humanity, pre-existing and outranking all man-made authority of any kind. rights that should never be violated, even if the majority supports such violations, and even if those in power claim that such violations are urgently necessary and are being done with the best of intentions. The authors of the Bill of Rights were well aware that once these principles are abandoned, the end result will always be unbridled tyranny. With that in mind, we will examine several of these fundamental principles to see where they have been respected and where they have been violated. The U.S. Constitution describes a very restricted, limited role for the federal government to play. The 9th and 10th Amendments, the last two in the Bill of Rights, declare not just that there are some things the federal government may not do, but that it may not do anything except for what is clearly and specifically authorized by the Constitution. Congress was not intended to have the power to control, regulate, or prohibit whatever it wished, but to have power only over certain specific matters. Such a concept cannot be found in the founding documents of the notorious tyrannies in history. On paper, this would seem to be a fundamental difference between the United States and many other regimes. But has that difference translated into reality? The federal law books today are full of thousands of pages of laws imposing taxation, regulation, and sometimes criminalization of matters which the Constitution never put under federal jurisdiction, including education, healthcare, food, retirement plans, caring for the poor, air travel, trains, cars, alcohol, tobacco, drugs, firearms, explosives, gambling, communications, employment practices, farming, wildlife, and all manner of production and manufacturing. In order to acquire and maintain power over such matters, politicians appointed judges to manufacture legal excuses for ignoring the constitutional limits on federal power. Of note, the Constitution itself does not say that the courts are the ultimate deciders of what is or is not constitutional. Nonetheless, shortly after the Constitution was written, the U.S. Supreme Court simply declared itself to be the ultimate judge of constitutionality. Since then, the federal courts have gradually whittled away at the concept of limited powers, fabricating justifications and rationalizations for violating the principle. One significant example occurred in 1942, when the Supreme Court ruled that Congress could regulate and control a farmer growing and consuming his own wheat on his own property under the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution. The outrageous rationale was that the farmer growing and consuming his own wheat, though such activity is neither interstate nor is it commerce, might have an indirect impact on interstate commerce, because if the farmer had not grown his own wheat, he might have purchased wheat elsewhere, which might have traveled through interstate commerce if he had. And so, with the obvious premeditated intention of drastically expanding federal power, the court simply manufactured a new legal excuse for putting nearly everyone and everything under federal control. Recently, the Supreme Court fabricated another new legal principle out of thin air to allow President Obama to force citizens to purchase private health insurance. As a result, Congress can now not only tax, regulate, control, and forbid anything it pleases, but can even force citizens to spend their own money on certain products or services, bringing to an end even the flimsiest facade of a federal government of limited powers. Both major political parties have enacted legislation far beyond anything the Constitution ever authorized, while continuing to appoint judges who will give their blessing to such actions. And this has often occurred with public approval, by people more interested in the promise of being protected and taken care of than they are in the fundamental principles of freedom. Ultimately, the American politician and the American voter have cooperated to completely destroy one of the primary checks against tyranny. The next obstacle to tyranny to examine is the concept of due process, which dictates that when the state intends to take someone's property or freedom, it may not do so arbitrarily, but may do so only by way of the legislative process, providing individuals with an opportunity to challenge the claims and actions of the government at an open and fair hearing before a neutral judge. And in criminal cases, the government may not punish people based on mere accusations or suspicions, but must provide evidence sufficient to convince a jury of his peers beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused has violated the law. While the Fifth Amendment mentions the right to due process, merely having such words on paper does not necessarily mean the principle will be adhered to in the real world. Indeed, similar concepts contained in the constitutions of Red China and the Soviet Union failed to stop those authoritarian regimes from murdering millions of human beings without charges or trial. The Constitution of the Weimar Republic, the government of Germany preceding Hitler's rise to power, was very thorough regarding the concept of due process, saying, quote, "The rights of the individual are inviolable. Limitation or deprivation of individual liberty is admissible only if based on laws. Persons deprived of their liberty have to be notified at the next day on the latest by which authority and based on which reasons the deprivation of their liberty has been ordered. Immediately, they have to be given the opportunity to protest against the deprivation of liberty." Technically, the Weimar Constitution was still in effect during Nazi reign. However, Article 48 of that Constitution provided that, in cases of national emergency, the government could suspend nearly all civil rights, including the right to due process. The idea that a government may not do certain things unless it decides to give itself permission to, in the name of some emergency, obviously contradicts the concept of unalienable rights. And though the U.S. Constitution does not authorize anyone to suspend the principle of due process, the U.S. government has spent decades fabricating excuses for circumventing and undermining the principle. The violations are not so blatant and drastic as those committed by the Soviet, Chinese, and Nazi governments, but are still significant. For example, by way of asset seizure laws relating to drug prohibition, federal and state governments in the U.S. now directly confiscate all sorts of property, cash, cars, boats, houses, and so on, that is merely alleged to be related to profits from the drug trade, without a warrant or court order, and without having to prove anything. In some cases, simply possessing a large enough amount of cash is, by itself, grounds for government agents to steal it, without the need for any trial, charges, warrant, or even any reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Then there's the concept of eminent domain, whereby the government can simply take private property for its own uses. The government is required to provide just compensation for private property it takes, with the government deciding what counts as just, and until recently, private property could only be taken for public use, meaning government purposes. That changed in 2005 when the Supreme Court proclaimed that governments could take private property from one person and give it to another based solely on the likelihood that doing so might create jobs and increase the government's tax revenues. Now, any government, federal, state, or local, can forcibly take any piece of property from one person and give it to another on the claim that doing so might help the economy. One of the most widespread violations of due process can be seen in the U.S. criminal justice system. In the vast majority of cases where an individual is accused of a crime in the United States, there is no trial, no jury, no public hearing, no proof of guilt, no evidence presented, and therefore no opportunity to challenge or rebut the evidence. This complete denial of the right to a fair public trial by a jury of one's peers is done via a procedure known as plea bargaining. In short, the accused is told that if he confesses, his punishment will be less harsh than if he demands a trial. When faced with the potential expense, embarrassment, fear, stress, and pain involved with being prosecuted by a government with virtually unlimited resources, even many innocent defendants confess, relieving those in power of having to prove guilt. Concepts such as innocent until proven guilty, having one's day in court, the state having the burden of proof, the proof needing to be beyond a reasonable doubt, and the right of the accused to not testify against himself are all destroyed by threatening and intimidating a defendant into accepting a relatively lenient punishment for a crime which may never have happened. The underlying message is a very old one. Confess, whether falsely or truthfully, and your suffering shall be reduced. To make matters worse, all defendants who submit to such threats are also required to sign a statement saying that they weren't coerced into confessing. Many countries, recognizing that plea bargains amount to forced confessions, prohibit the practice. But in the United States, it is how the vast majority of criminal accusations are settled, without evidence, without a trial, without the government ever proving anything. But the ultimate contempt for due process evolved relatively recently in the U.S., with the Bush and Obama administrations claiming the right to indefinitely detain individuals without trial or charges, meaning someone could be imprisoned for life without ever being formally accused of any wrongdoing, or even if he was charged, put on trial and found not guilty. Even more drastic than that is the policy, again condoned by the Bush and Obama administrations, saying that the president has the power to issue orders to kill individuals outright, foreigners and U.S. citizens, without warrant, trial, or charges. The result of all these policies is that, notwithstanding what the Fifth Amendment says about due process, the federal government can take the property, freedom, and life of any individual it chooses without any due process at all. Related to the concept of due process is the concept of the presumption of innocence, the idea that the government may not treat people like criminals, detaining, searching, interrogating, or punishing them unless and until there is specific evidence indicating that a crime has been committed. The Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures and requires warrants based on probable cause and approved by a neutral judge before government agents can search one's person, belongings, or property. But again, the mere existence of words on paper does not by itself guarantee anything. Tyranny is epitomized by the image of a Nazi, KGB, or Stasi agent stopping people at random, demanding to see their papers, questioning them about where they are going and what they are doing. In sharp contrast is the image of an American having the right to be left in peace, the right to remain silent, to refuse to answer questions, and to refuse to allow himself or his property to be searched without a warrant. However, that distinction is fading as those in power continue to invent new ways to circumvent and undermine the principle of presumption of innocence, under the guise of combating drugs, terrorism, and illegal immigration, among other things. For example, random traffic stops are now regularly performed at so-called border checkpoints that can be anywhere within 100 miles of the border. To stop drivers at random to ask if they are in the country illegally is, in principle, no different than stopping every driver to ask if he has robbed anyone, when there is no reason to suspect that he has. Because of the Fifth Amendment, even one who has committed a crime cannot be compelled to say so. As a result, the implication of random traffic stops is that guilty people need not admit it, while innocent people may be arrested for not professing their innocence, as has already happened with people who had committed no crime being violently assaulted and charged with resisting arrest or obstructing justice simply for not cooperating with warrantless, suspicionless detention and interrogation. At so-called sobriety checkpoints, every car is stopped, briefly searched from the outside, and the driver is asked if he has been drinking. Because such stops are usually brief and minimally intrusive, and are done in the name of combating drunk driving, many people accept or even praise the practice, despite it being an obvious violation of the Fourth and Fifth Amendments. The mentality is that if it stops one drunk driver, then it is worth it. But once the premise is accepted that presumption of innocence should be abandoned in the name of safety, what argument would remain, for example, against the idea that if it prevents one violent crime or one terrorist attack, then the police should be allowed to conduct random unannounced raids of private homes, without even a reason for suspicion. Every totalitarian police state has grown out of such a mindset. And the tactic of detaining and interrogating people at random is not limited to traffic stops. Americans have long since grown accustomed to being questioned and having their belongings rummaged through before boarding a plane. But since 9/11, 2001, anyone who wants to fly must now be subjected to an electronic strip search or a thorough physical pat-down, which in many jurisdictions fits the legal definition of sexual assault. This is the natural progression of things once a fundamental principle is abandoned. Many Americans now blithely accept being treated like criminals in the name of safety and security, being detained, interrogated, and searched without any reason to believe they have done anything wrong. And this now occurs not just at airports, but in certain housing projects, in parts of New York with the new stop and frisk policy, on the Houston bus system, and elsewhere. The response has been mixed, with some praising the tyrannical practice as a good way to reduce crime, and others objecting to the obvious violations of privacy and civil rights. Whether such practices will continue and expand depends largely on whether the people will tolerate it, which in turn depends upon whether the people understand and care about the basic principles of liberty. Some Americans who are still aware of their rights, when stopped and confronted by the police without cause, refuse to consent to a search or questioning, and instead ask, "Am I free to go or am I being detained? And if I am being detained, what is your probable cause to suspect that I have committed a crime?" Even doing this, no matter how politely, often results in open hostility from the police, and condemnation and insults from other Americans who view such actions as the behavior of a criminal and troublemaker. This demonstrates the growing rift between, on the one hand, those who have accepted the authoritarian attitude that one should, without question or hesitation, cooperate with whatever someone in a uniform tells them to do, and on the other hand, those Americans who still understand and respect the fundamental principles of individual liberty. The concept of presumption of innocence also implies a right to privacy regarding one's records and correspondence, one's papers, as the Fourth Amendment puts it. However, the way the federal income tax is currently applied destroys the financial privacy of Americans. Based on the claim that all income, all expenses, almost every type of financial transaction is relevant to determining an individual's income tax liability, the U.S. government claims the right to demand, by way of an IRS audit, almost every type of personal financial record imaginable, without a warrant and without even the accusation that the person has done anything wrong. And there are countless other ways in which presumption of innocence is being eroded. Warrantless spying on all sorts of communications, agents being allowed to write their own search warrants, rendering the entire concept of a warrant pointless, so-called sneak and peek searches and national security letters, the legality of which cannot be challenged because the ones being spied on are never told that it happened, and those who find out are threatened with imprisonment if they tell anyone else. In spite of the Fourth Amendment, today Americans are not secure in their persons, or their houses, or their papers, or their effects. The concept of presumption of innocence has been abandoned by both major political parties and by a large portion of the American public. One of the most classic signs of tyranny is when the people dare not publicly criticize their own government. But even the regimes which most violently crushed all dissent and criticism pretended to support freedom of speech. And the fact that the U.S. Constitution also mentions freedom of speech has not stopped those in power from trying to silence dissent, directly and indirectly. Examples of direct censorship would include the Sedition Act of 1798, the forcible confiscation of newspapers and the arrest of news editors during the Civil War, and a second Sedition Act passed in 1918. But for the most part, those in power in the U.S. have had to rely on more subtle, indirect methods, dissuading people from speaking out using veiled or not so veiled threats, insults, or intimidation to create what the Supreme Court calls a chilling effect. This can take different forms, such as the government demanding that dissident groups hand over a list of their members, which was ruled unconstitutional in 1958, or federal agents monitoring certain individuals or groups, openly or covertly, based upon their political beliefs, or keeping lists of those critical of government and characterizing them as potential terrorists, or stopping and questioning people based on what their bumper stickers or t-shirts say. The goal of all such tactics is to use intimidation and harassment to discourage people from speaking their minds, or from associating with others who do. The recent demonization of all manner of groups, conservative and liberal, which have been critical of current government policies, and the herding of protesters into so-called free speech zones are further examples of indirect attempts to silence dissent. Another tactic that is not exactly censorship but has the same goal is those in power exerting undue influence over the media by giving preferential treatment and more access to news outlets sympathetic to the agenda of those in power, and using connections and influence to persuade news agencies to slant the news a certain way, or to downplay or simply ignore certain events and stories. In 2005, the story broke that the Bush administration had even produced numerous propaganda pieces which were then aired in the mainstream media as if they were news reports, with the obvious goal of using what Americans imagine to be a free press to sway public opinion to favor those in power. More recently, the federal government was caught having agents create numerous fake personas to use on social media websites in an attempt to discredit those critical of the government and create the appearance of a more pro-government public opinion. Such tactics are used to weaken dissenting opinions by drowning them out with government-created pro-authoritarian messages, posing as news reports or the thoughtful opinions of concerned citizens. But despite such disinformation tactics and the attempt by those in power to publicly malign or denigrate any who oppose their agenda, for the most part, freedom of speech remains alive and well in the United States, especially in the alternative media, which now dominates the internet, which those in power have been unable to control. Unlike the philosophical principles of limited powers, due process, and presumption of innocence, the principle of freedom of speech is still understood and cherished by nearly all Americans. Dissent and protest is, in fact, becoming more and more widespread, despite government efforts to undermine it through spying, propaganda, vilification, and intimidation. Perhaps the most conspicuous difference between the U.S. Constitution and the constitutions of other countries is found in the Second Amendment, which describes the inherent right of the people to be armed. During the founding of the country, Federalists and Anti-Federalists alike openly opined that the people should always remain armed, not merely to defend against common criminals or foreign invaders, but to retain the ability to forcibly resist their own government. An armed populace is essential to the idea that the people have the right and duty to alter or abolish any government that has become destructive of individual liberties, as the Declaration of Independence says. In contrast, the constitutions of many tyrannical regimes have claimed that all political power belongs to the people, but never gave any teeth to that idea by allowing the people themselves to remain armed. Most regimes claim a monopoly on the use of force, asserting that the police and military exist to protect the people, without mentioning the fact that, historically, what the people have most often needed protection from has been their own government. Tyrants have often pushed the idea, under the excuse of safety and preventing crime, that only the police and military should be armed. In retrospect, their motivation becomes clear. Those who seek to control and exploit a population do not want the people to have the ability to forcibly resist. For decades, some American politicians have exhibited a similar attitude. Recently, the U.S. government has dramatically escalated its attempts to disarm the general public, or at least to significantly limit the firepower possessed by the people. Even though nothing in the Constitution puts such matters under federal jurisdiction, and even though the Second Amendment specifically prohibits the federal government from enacting any so-called gun control. Twice, near Ruby Ridge, Idaho in 1992 and near Waco, Texas in 1993, the U.S. government has carried out what can only be described as violent paramilitary assaults against private citizens in their own homes, not because anyone had been threatened or harmed, but only because someone was alleged to be in possession of certain guns or gun parts, which the federal government had declared to be illegal. Randy Weaver's home was attacked. His son was shot to death. His wife was shot to death as she stood in her own home holding her baby. And Mr. Weaver and a friend were both shot but survived. The entire incident stemmed from the fact that Mr. Weaver was alleged to have sold 2 shotguns whose barrels were slightly shorter than allowed by law. In the Waco incident, the original paramilitary assault, the deadly shootout, the prolonged siege, the prolonged physical and emotional torture inflicted on the Branch Davidians by federal agents, and finally the fire that destroyed the entire compound. The entire incident, which cost the lives of 80 American men, women, children, and babies, was all the result of an unsubstantiated rumor that David Koresh was in possession of parts that could be used to convert semi-automatic firearms into fully automatic firearms. That incident occurred under the leadership of Janet Reno. With some exceptions, in the U.S., private ownership of fully automatic machine guns and various explosives has been illegal for many decades. For the past 20 years, some have been trying to ban even semi-automatic military-style rifles and the high-capacity magazines for such weapons. Not only has disarming the general public been shown to increase crime, but these particular types of weapons have never been used in more than a tiny percentage of crime, yet they receive most of the attention of those in government pushing for gun control. Perhaps because such weapons, while not at all ideal for the common criminal due to being unwieldy, expensive, and difficult to conceal, are ideal for resisting an authoritarian police force or standing army. In any country, it is to be expected that those in power, those who seek out political office and believe it is their place to manage and control society, will not want those whom they control to have the means to resist those doing the controlling. Of course, those in power always claim that their motive for disarming their subjects is to preserve law and order and keep the people safe. Despite the many examples of brutal oppression which have historically followed public disarmament, those currently in power in the U.S. have managed to convince a large percentage of Americans to enthusiastically demand that they themselves be disarmed. Most Americans simply cannot imagine that their own government has any intention of violently dominating and controlling the people, just as the people of China, Russia, and Germany no doubt couldn't imagine it. However, in addition to the recent all-out push for so-called gun control, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security recently ordered over 1.5 billion rounds of ammunition, which comes to 5 bullets for every man, woman, and child in the country, purchased by an agency that is not involved in international war, but is purely about domestic law enforcement. One does not buy such a quantity of ammunition, much of it hollow point, designed to do maximum damage to the human body, unless one is planning for a large-scale armed conflict. Add to that the gradual militarization of many local and state police forces, several thousand armored vehicles ordered by Homeland Security, and, perhaps most shockingly, the admission by the top law enforcement official in the country under the Obama administration that he believes that it would be both legal and justifiable not just to kill foreigners abroad, not just to kill U.S. citizens abroad, as has already occurred, but to kill U.S. citizens on U.S. soil without charge or trial if the president decides they are a threat to government. In recent years, various flyers and memos from state and federal law enforcement agencies have surfaced showing what those in power consider to be signs that someone might be a threat. Things such as asking for the legal authority for a traffic stop, making frequent references to the Constitution or constitutional rights, concerns about loss of liberty and expanding government power, and particularly concerns about violations of the right of the people to keep and bear arms. In other words, anyone who is aware of the fundamental principles which prevent tyranny and who is concerned about the violation of those principles is, in the eyes of some in power, a potential terrorist. If at any point any group of Americans decides to resist any one of the numerous infringements on their unalienable rights going on today, as the Declaration of Independence says is their right and duty, the government can simply declare the resistors to be enemy combatants, which, according to those now in power, would justify murdering the resistors outright without charges and without a trial. Under every tyrannical regime, every new violation of civil rights was committed in the name of law. Any who disobeyed were deemed criminals, and any who forcibly resisted were called rebels, insurgents, or terrorists. Using this template, tyrants have inflicted one act of aggression after another against the people, and then violently crushed any opposition or resistance that arose in the name of enforcing the law, preventing crime, and keeping order. Every law, every regulation, every policy of every government is imposed upon the people via armed enforcers. So when those in power seek to legislatively violate the fundamental principles of individual liberty, in the end, the only real guard against tyranny is the ability of the people to forcibly resist their own government. In 1776 and today, that ability relies mainly upon one thing: firearms. Despite decades of trying, U.S. politicians have, so far, failed to disarm the American people. Even the recent full-blown nationwide campaign of emotionalism and fear-mongering designed to scare the people into tolerating or even demanding public disarmament has only resulted in record numbers of firearm and ammunition sales. Those who seek dominion over others always claim that they need the power in order to protect and serve the people. Indeed, the most horrific examples of man's inhumanity to man have been done in the name of the people and the common good. The preamble of the Constitution of what became the most murderous regime in history states that the Chinese people have often fought, quote, for democracy and freedom, and that after Mao's communist revolution, quote, the Chinese people took state power into their own hands and became masters of the country. Every tyrannical regime pretends to represent the very people it oppresses. The Constitution of the USSR asserted that it was the job of the Soviet government to, quote, ensure the maintenance of law and order and safeguard the interests of society and the rights and freedoms of citizens. If there is one commonality among all tyrants, Mao, Stalin, Lenin, Hitler, Mussolini, Pol Pot, and countless others, it is the collectivist philosophy, the idea that it is justifiable and even noble to sacrifice the rights of the individual in the name of serving some greater good. All successful tyrants, whether politically categorized as far right or far left, built their regimes on the notion that if some authoritarian master plan benefits society as a whole, then the ends justify the means, and individual rights can and should be ignored. This idea is the antithesis of the concept of unalienable rights and individual freedom. Collectivism, whether it takes the form of communism, socialism, nationalism, fascism, or even democracy, has been used over and over again as the excuse for violent oppression. And over again, people have fallen for collectivist ideas because on the surface they sound altruistic and noble. An individual can feel good about giving up some of what is his to benefit his neighbor, his community, or his country, to be part of something greater than himself. But there is a fundamental difference between, on the one hand, someone voluntarily choosing to help his fellow man and to cooperate for mutual benefit, and on the other hand, having the state force individuals into doing whatever those in power say is for the common good. The former is the basis of a civil society. The latter is always the basis for tyranny. Government, by its very nature, is not about voluntary cooperation. It is about a ruling class legislating a central plan, forcing the people to comply and punishing any who don't conform. But tyrants have learned that the best way to trick someone into tolerating his own subjugation is to convince him that it will somehow benefit his fellow man, or society as a whole. Every tyrant uses this lie to exploit the compassion and virtues of the common people in order to enslave them in the name of the common good. At the founding of the United States, there was a fundamentally different idea, the idea that the only legitimate purpose of government is to protect and defend the rights of individuals. The idea that peace, prosperity, and justice come not from an authoritarian ruling class controlling and micromanaging society, but from free and equal individuals trading and cooperating voluntarily, each free to do as he pleases, provided he does not infringe on the rights of others. In fact, all of the principles which prevent tyranny are merely extensions of the idea that every human being has a right to live, to be free, and to pursue his own happiness in whatever way he sees fit, and that the good of society is best served by recognizing and respecting the human rights of every individual. In contrast, collectivism teaches that it is permissible, even desirable, that every individual be controlled, taxed, monitored, regulated, censored, disarmed, and subjugated in whatever way and to whatever degree the rulers say will best serve the nation. Though historical tyrannies have varied regarding racial, religious, economic, territorial, and cultural issues, every one of them, left and right, shared the idea that it is justifiable to sacrifice the rights of the individual at the altar of the collective. a truly dangerous idea which both major political parties in the US and those who vote for them have now adopted. Indeed, the political speeches of modern American politicians contain rhetoric very similar to that used by the infamous tyrants of history. To a large degree, America has abandoned the idea of unalienable rights and individual liberty, and has embraced instead the philosophy of tyrants, collectivism. Today, the Jeffersonian view of unalienable individual rights is a completely foreign concept to most Americans. And history shows that once the people themselves have forsaken the primary philosophical principle which prevents tyranny, freedom and justice will not long survive. Every tyrant tells his subjects that if they will just give up their freedom in favor of authoritarian power, then he can protect them from all the dangers and uncertainties of life, including economic troubles, crime, and especially foreign enemies. One tyrant after another has inflicted drastic injustice and hardship on his own people in the name of protecting them against some evil outside threat, whether that threat was genuine or exaggerated or simply made up. The blind nationalism and tolerance of domestic surveillance and oppression, which comes from being at war, has enabled many tyrants to get away with extreme brutality. The latest excuse for perpetual war is to spread democracy around the world. But regardless of the exact excuse, once the fear-mongering and war propaganda is in full gear, most dare not resist with words or actions for fear of being perceived as traitors or cowards, or even worse, sympathizers with the enemy. As the head of the Nazi Gestapo put it, quote, "Naturally, the common people don't want war, but after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it is a democracy or a fascist dictatorship or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. All you have to do is to tell them they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger." This tactic has been effective for many centuries, exploiting the natural pack mentality of human beings. The us versus them mentality has always been an effective tool for tyrants in duping the people into showing blind loyalty to their political masters and tolerating all manner of injustice and oppression from their own government. And rather than waiting around to be attacked, tyrants will instigate violent conflicts while playing the part of the innocent victim in order to use foreign war as an excuse for domestic tyranny. Even Plato described this tactic 2,000 years ago. The founders of the United States were also well aware that war is often used as an excuse for oppression. Often, tyrants have used propaganda and false flag operations to start a war as an excuse to claim more power for themselves. It is highly likely, for example, that the Nazis themselves burned down the Reichstag, their own parliament building, in order to blame their enemies as an excuse to curtail civil rights and institute martial law. They also carried out Operation Himmler, in which Nazi agents staged elaborate events to appear as attacks on Germany by Poland, immediately after which Hitler invaded Poland, claiming it was an act of defense. saying he would fight, quote, until the safety of the Reich and its rights are secured. Every warmonger knows that to win public support, he must play the part of reluctant fighter, who goes to war only when absolutely necessary in order to defend truth and justice from foreign evildoers. Such rhetoric works simply because people never want to imagine that their own leaders are malicious warmongers who would intentionally cause unnecessary suffering and death, and this leaves the people very receptive to the propaganda fed to them by their own governments. Recently declassified documents show that under the presidency of John F. Kennedy, the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff approved a series of covert military actions, collectively known as Operation Northwoods, whereby the U.S. government would stage fake terrorist actions, including on U.S. soil, and blame Fidel Castro for the events in order to win public support for a military invasion of Cuba. The documents went into detail describing plans to attack U.S. military ships, stage mock hijackings or the shooting down of civilian airliners, and so on. While this particular operation was not carried out, the documents give a clear view of the deceptive warmongering mentality of some of the highest officials in the United States military and government, who plan to commit false flag terrorist actions in order to deceive the American public into demanding war. While the documents clearly proving this are publicly available, few Americans know about it, and the mainstream American media has given the matter only brief mention, allowing most Americans to comfortably but mistakenly assume that their government would never engage in the types of deception, propaganda, emotional manipulation, false flag terrorism, and warmongering that so many other regimes have been known to engage in. So how are people to tell the difference between honest leaders fighting against real threats and would-be tyrants using deception and public fear to empower themselves and enslave the people? The answer is quite simple. If those in power seek to preserve the fundamental principles of liberty, they can probably be trusted. But if their solution is to sacrifice and violate those principles, then they are tyrants, no matter what excuses or rationalizations they try to hide behind. Those who have been brought up to feel loyalty to their nation are often incapable of seeing history and world events in any objective sort of way. For example, most Americans view the prolonged bombing of London by the German Luftwaffe during World War II, with its 40,000 civilian deaths, as a cowardly, heinous atrocity, but view the nuclear annihilation of Nagasaki and Hiroshima by the U.S. military as righteous acts of defense, despite the latter killing 4 times as many civilians as the former, and about 70 times the number killed on 9/11/2001. The victors write the history books, and every empire reports events in the light most favorable to itself. Facts or events that do not serve the positive image of the regime are downplayed, distorted, or simply ignored. Few Americans are aware of the horrible devastation, with over 20,000 civilians killed, from the tactically pointless firebombing of Dresden in 1945 by U.S. and British air forces, or the firebombing of Tokyo in the same year, which killed upwards of 100,000 civilians. In every country, children are taught that their nation is great and noble, and that their leaders are courageous and virtuous. State propaganda always seeks to muddle together the concepts of love of one's country on the one hand, and blind loyalty to the nation's ruling class on the other. This tends to make the people passive, subservient, and easily controlled by those in power, and makes people use an extreme double standard when judging the morality of government actions. During the Vietnam War, Americans who spoke out against sending young men off to fight and die, and even those who protested outright atrocities committed by U.S. troops, such as occurred at My Lai, were often accused by other Americans of hating America, as if the noble and patriotic thing to do during a time of national conflict is to turn a blind eye to any evil done by one's own countrymen. As a more recent example of the nationalistic love it or leave it mentality, many Americans view Bradley Manning as a traitor for leaking evidence of U.S. troops committing murder. And when images surfaced of American soldiers openly delighting in the torturing and suffering of helpless prisoners, and when the details of the torture committed at the behest of the U.S. government in the Extraordinary Rendition program became widely known, many Americans, in government and out, downplayed the findings or tried to justify and excuse them. Almost without fail, those same Americans vehemently condemn as barbaric and unforgivable torture committed by other regimes. People around the world have, all too often, shown more loyalty to a particular flag than to morality and justice. Nationalistic bias can also be seen in the fact that all American school children have heard the name Adolf Hitler and associate it with evil and tyranny, but many know nothing about Mao Zedong or Joseph Stalin, each of whom headed regimes which murdered far more people than Hitler's Third Reich. The difference is that the U.S. government had open alliances, military or economic, with Mao and Stalin, but not with Hitler. Even though Stalin was an ally of Hitler at the start of World War II, after he later switched sides, the American media and the U.S. government began characterizing the second worst mass murderer in history as Uncle Joe Stalin, because it didn't serve those in Washington to have the American people seeing their new ally as the murderous dictator he was, or knowing about the heinous atrocities committed by his armies. Likewise, despite the British Empire's long history of widespread brutal imperialism in India, parts of Africa, and elsewhere, including in the American colonies, most Americans have been taught to have a generally positive view of England, simply because maintaining the image that one's own government is noble and virtuous requires maintaining the belief that the allies of one's government are noble and virtuous. Nationalistic bias can be seen regarding domestic oppression as well. Despite the countless cases of American police being caught lying under oath, planting evidence, intimidating, harassing, threatening, assaulting, and sometimes even murdering unarmed civilians, and despite the fact that whenever this happens, other police officers and departments invariably attempt to downplay, cover up, or even excuse such abuses, many Americans still believe that American law enforcement is on the side of freedom and justice, except for a few bad apples. No matter how many instances of police brutality and corruption come to light, many Americans insist on believing that those are the exception rather than the rule. Yet when they see similar behavior from police forces in other countries, they have no problem recognizing it as oppression. What Americans imagine to be the freest country on earth has the highest incarceration rate in the world, with well over 2 million individuals currently caged, most of them for victimless crimes, a number far higher even than are imprisoned in communist China, despite China having a total population over 4 times that of the U.S. Americans tend to view the killing of unarmed protesters in Tiananmen Square in 1989 as typical and representative of the nature of the Chinese government, but view the killing of 4 unarmed student protesters at Kent State in 1970 by the Ohio National Guard as an unfortunate fluke. They may view the execution of the members of the White Rose, a German group concerned with the growing tyranny of the Nazi government, as a sign of a truly oppressive regime, while viewing the armed paramilitary assault and slaughter of the Branch Davidians, a group concerned with the growing tyranny of the U.S. government, as a regrettable error in judgment. Even more dramatically, many of the same Americans who recognize and righteously condemn the forced eviction and mass murder of the Jews by the Third Reich say little or nothing about the forced eviction and mass murder of the American Indians by the U.S. government. While this has finally begun to change, for many years in America, one example of racial genocide was solemnly remembered as the low point in human history, while the other was romanticized and glorified in books and movies, and even by little children playing cowboys and Indians. The point is not that all authoritarian atrocities and injustices have been the same in scale or severity. The point is that one's nationality tends to make one more likely to forgive and forget evils perpetrated by those wearing his flag, and more likely to condemn and remember the evils committed under other flags. And this phenomenon has been a huge help to tyrants around the world, whose subjects have been quick to judge foreign dictators, but slow to recognize and criticize injustices committed by their own rulers. It is easy for Americans to be judgmental about those Russians who still revere Lenin and Stalin as great and noble leaders, and those Chinese who still glorify and praise Mao Zedong. But the people of every nation are taught to view themselves and their leaders as virtuous and enlightened, while viewing the subjects of other regimes as ignorant, indoctrinated, and brainwashed. Consider the example of Abraham Lincoln, still revered in the U.S. as the great emancipator, fighter for truth, liberty, and justice. By any objective measure, Lincoln's actions showed him to be a vicious tyrant, with no respect for individual rights or for the Constitution. American children are rightly taught about the evils of slavery, but are then taught, implicitly if not explicitly, that it was righteous for Lincoln to do whatever he had to in order to end slavery, even though that was not the primary reason for the war. Tyrants throughout history have used the narrow, simplistic, good guys versus bad guys mindset to imply that if one's enemy is evil, then whatever one has to do to fight that enemy must be justified. And in the name of saving the Union, Lincoln violated every fundamental principle of liberty and justice. Not only does nothing in the Constitution authorize the use of military might to forcibly prevent states from leaving the Union, but where military force is to be used, it is Congress, not the President, empowered by the Constitution to declare war, which never happened during the Civil War. Furthermore, under the Constitution, only Congress may appropriate funds for military actions. President Lincoln simply stole the funds to carry out his own dictatorial military occupation of the states which sought only to peacefully secede and become independent. Instead of allowing that, Lincoln single-handedly started a war that killed over 600,000 Americans, more than died in World War I, World War II, and Vietnam combined. The Civil War was also the first time that the federal government used military conscription, forcing tens of thousands of men to kill or die for the Union. The Confederacy did likewise, triggering much criticism and resistance. It is ironic that Lincoln is now known as the man who ended involuntary servitude, even though he forcibly conscripted and enslaved thousands of individuals, not to pick cotton, but to engage in mortal combat, and in many cases to suffer and die. This set the precedent that the government may enslave people as unwilling mercenaries whenever it wishes, which it has done on several occasions since then, a practice as antithetical to individual liberty as any could possibly be. In a glaring violation of freedom of speech, Lincoln also forcibly seized newspapers in the North and arrested newspaper editors critical of his actions. He also violated the principle of habeas corpus, ordering thousands of non-combatants, including hundreds of women, to be forcibly taken hostage without warrant or trial, without even the accusation that they had committed any crime. At Lincoln's bidding, Union forces also engaged in widespread theft, vandalism, and terrorism in the South against civilians as well as combatants. In essence, Abraham Lincoln did what Mao, Stalin, and Hitler would later do, unilaterally claiming dictatorial powers, violently crushing opposition and dissent, and violating every fundamental principle of liberty and justice in the name of uniting the country. And yet he is still all but deified by most Americans as a great and noble leader and savior. And other U.S. presidents are also still glorified, despite the oppressions they inflicted on the people. From the beginning of the country and continuing for many decades, the government's treatment of Native Americans and of black slaves constituted an obvious, drastic violation of unalienable rights by way of widespread harassment, assault, torture, enslavement, and murder. Other, more isolated abuses have been occurring from the beginning. John Adams, the second president of the U.S., signed into law the Sedition Act, which essentially made it a crime to criticize government, an obvious and gross violation of the First Amendment, just 7 years after the Bill of Rights was enacted. During World War II, the principles of due process and presumption of innocence were blatantly violated by FDR when he ordered the imprisoning of over 100,000 people of Japanese descent, most of them U.S. citizens, without charge or trial, based solely on their ancestry. This was done dictator style, by unilateral executive order, without any constitutional basis for doing so, though it was done with the blessing of the Supreme Court. Concerning the concept of limited federal powers, both FDR and LBJ, in the name of the New Deal and the Great Society, demolished the concept of a limited government, expanding federal control into the fields of education, transportation, healthcare, retirement, and welfare, among others, matters which the Constitution never put under federal jurisdiction. Indeed, the presidents who have done the most to destroy the principles of liberty are the ones most usually praised and adored today, and seen as great progressive leaders. As a result, nearly all of the principles described in the Bill of Rights are now violated every day in every state in the Union. Concerning the right of the people to be armed, perhaps the most glaring violation occurred relatively recently, when in New Orleans, in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, police and military went door to door, forcibly disarming innocent civilians without warrant, without probable cause, without anything in the Constitution authorizing such actions. Despite all of these examples and countless others that could be given, Americans still refer to the U.S. as a free country. All evidence to the contrary, no matter how overt or appalling, is usually dismissed either under the excuse that those were just isolated, unfortunate exceptions, or even more commonly under the excuse that other regimes have been even more vicious and brutal. While quite true, resorting to such an argument amounts to conceding that America is not free, while arguing it should nonetheless be unconditionally praised and never characterized as oppressive or tyrannical, based solely on the fact that other empires have been worse. In this way, legitimate objection and dissent is squelched through shaming or intimidation by other Americans who believe that pointing out genuine injustice and tyranny in one's own country is unpatriotic, if not traitorous. Most of the fundamental philosophical principles which serve as a check against tyranny have been abandoned by nearly all U.S. politicians and voters. Americans have been scared into surrendering their basic rights in the name of safety and security, as has happened under so many other authoritarian regimes. The threat of war, terrorism, crime, poverty, and economic troubles have been used by America's political elite just as they have been used by foreign tyrants to intimidate the people into tolerating, and in many cases demanding, a level of government power and control that has virtually no limits. Many Americans now openly beg for government control of nearly everything without even realizing it, because they have grown ignorant and have become convinced that more power for the rulers means more security for the people, the lie on which all tyrannies are based. Being unaware of the fundamental principles of freedom and their importance, most Americans have willingly, eagerly given them up to whatever politician promised to protect them and take care of them. The progression of the United States empire, with its ever-expanding government power and ever-contracting individual freedom, is following the same general path that every tyrannical regime in history has. In terms of economics, the U.S. is less free than Hong Kong, Australia, Switzerland, and Canada, among others. While quantitating overall freedom is very difficult, most attempts to do so rank the United States in 10th place or lower and headed down. Every government puts out propaganda telling the people that they are free, that their country is the best, and that a strong government means a strong country. In reality, government power is always inversely proportional to individual freedom. Despite wishful thinking to the contrary, it can happen here. It already did happen here. It continues to happen here, and the situation is only getting worse. If America was ever special and different, it is no more, because the mentality and philosophy of the American people is no longer different. The perpetual bickering for handouts from the rulers, individuals and groups all begging for state power to be used to serve their interests at the expense of someone else, each clamoring for collectivist programs and benefits for themselves and more restrictions and punishments for others. In a society where nearly everything is already taxed, regulated, controlled, and monitored, these are the symptoms of a defeated and conquered subject class, not a free people. Americans hallucinate freedom while everything they eat and drink, where they can live, what they can drive, what work they can do, what they can build, is all restricted and regulated. Children's lemonade stands shut down by the police. Armed paramilitary raids of food co-ops and small farms. Kidnapping and caging of people for growing a certain plant. A fee, permit, or license required to own a dog, to sell cookies, to build a deck, to braid hair, to catch a fish, to get married, to grow vegetables, and still that persistent lie about a free country. Some who have never personally been arrested, harassed, or assaulted by government agents attempt to treat that as proof that the U.S. is not at all tyrannical. This claim ignores the fact that most people living in Nazi Germany were never arrested, assaulted, or directly harassed by government agents, nor were most of those living in the Soviet Union or China. Even under the most vicious regimes in history, the majority of those who did as they were told and who quietly allowed themselves to be robbed of the fruits of their labor in order to fund the police state and the war machine had little trouble from those in power, and many lived relatively safe, comfortable lives. In most cases, only those with the conscience and courage to speak out or act out against injustice have been subjected to the overt brutality of totalitarianism. Of course, different empires have carried out different injustices. The point is not that the degree of oppression in the US is the same as what occurred in Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, or Communist China. Obviously, it is not. The point is that, regardless of the precise scale and level of brutality, a regime which can forcibly control all manner of choices and behaviors, which can secretly spy on its citizens without warrants, which imprisons millions for victimless crimes, a regime whose police can stop, detain, search, interrogate, cage, assault, even murder people without even any suspicion of criminal activity, and get away with it, whether that is done to 10 people or 10 million, that is tyranny. And once the precedent has been set that such actions are tolerated by the people, that those who perpetrate such acts are rewarded instead of punished, that there is no recourse against such injustice via the legal system, then it is inevitable that such actions will increase in frequency and severity. The degree of violence and brutality which the U.S. government inflicts upon the American people may be less than that of other authoritarian regimes, but the fundamental nature of the empire is the same, because the basic philosophical principles that prevent tyranny have been forsaken and forgotten by those in power and even by most of the victims of state extortion and oppression. If history is any indication, the brutality and violence of the empire will continue to increase unless and until the people choose to stop it. The United States has followed the same pattern as many nations, starting with relative freedom, growing economically, then having the government getting more powerful in military might around the world, and in the ability to exploit and control its own people, with ever-increasing taxation and regulation. Historically, the growth of state power and the simultaneous shrinking of liberty continues until economic or political collapse or revolution stops it. But is there any other way to prevent the steady, predictable march toward totalitarianism? Americans are taught to believe that their ability to vote means that they are free, but the subjects of many authoritarian regimes had and still have the ability to vote, which has consistently failed to prevent widespread brutal tyranny and mass murder. Like many tyrants, Adolf Hitler was elected into power in Germany, and later the people of Austria voted overwhelmingly to accept annexation by the Third Reich, demonstrating that if the people themselves forsake the principles of liberty, their ability to vote will do nothing to prevent totalitarianism. In the U.S., as elsewhere, often the candidates who enjoy the strongest public support and the past politicians who are now most respected and revered are the ones who violated the principles of liberty most boldly and dramatically. Today, candidates from both major parties give lip service to the concept of unalienable rights, but betray and violate it in almost every action they take. Americans may scoff at the facade of democracy that existed in the Soviet Union because the right to vote is obviously meaningless when there's only one party on the ballot. However, being given the choice between two candidates, neither of whom has any respect for the principles which prevent tyranny, may strengthen the facade that elections matter, but still renders the ability to vote a useless tool against totalitarianism. The only presidential candidate for decades who showed true loyalty to the basic principles of liberty was openly hated, scorned, ridiculed, vilified, slandered, and suppressed by both major parties, by the entire political establishment, and by the mainstream media. Whenever there's a powerful elite that chooses the candidates offered to the public, whether the powers that be offer up one candidate, 2, or 10, voting can never be an effective way to prevent tyranny. Many Americans understand that pure democracy, which is simply mob rule, can lead to tyranny, but imagine that having a democratic constitutional republic prevents it. But the most brutal regimes in history began as democratic constitutional republics. The People's Republic of China, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and the Weimar Republic, out of which Nazi power grew. Without a firm adherence to the fundamental principles of liberty, the particular structure of the ruling class does nothing to prevent widespread oppression and injustice. Indeed, the degree of oppression in the American colonies under the rule of a king was, in terms of taxation, regulation, intrusion, and interference, far less than what is now done to the American people by their own supposedly limited, democratically chosen, constitutional republican form of government. The country which was designed to have the most limited pro-liberty government ever because it has abandoned most of the fundamental principles of freedom, has become the most powerful authoritarian empire in history, with the biggest standing army, the biggest taxing machine, and the most intrusive regulatory system in the world, all things the Constitution was supposed to prevent, making it plain that having a constitution, allowing elections, and having a republican form of government does not prevent tyranny. Many believe that the only proper civilized way to combat tyranny is through political action, by getting involved in the process, campaigning, running for office, supporting this or that candidate or party. However, the track record of such political action warding off oppression and tyranny has been a dismal failure, largely because tyranny, at least at first, nearly always has the support of a well-intentioned but deceived and misinformed public. Whenever a majority falls for the promises of some new would-be ruler, pitching state power and control under the guise of the pleasant-sounding collectivist philosophy, the inevitable result cannot be avoided by having the minority playing the game of electoral politics. In the U.S., since before the ink was even dry on the Constitution, there were individuals and groups ardently trying to preserve freedom and prevent tyranny. Even the Constitution itself was a victory for those preferring more centralized government control, and a defeat for the anti-federalists who voiced concern that the principles of individual liberty were already in danger. Patrick Henry, for example, refused to attend the Constitutional Convention, famously saying, "I smell a rat." For well over 200 years since then, various well-meaning individuals and groups have enthusiastically lobbied, petitioned, campaigned, and voted, trying to defend the concepts of individual liberty against the steady encroachments of increasing government power. Through it all, the size and scope of government control expanded, and personal liberty decreased. Other than a few tiny temporary blips, the hard work of countless political activists who poured their hearts and souls into seeking a political remedy not only failed to return the country to constitutional principles, but even failed to break even, to at least hold authoritarian power and control at existing levels. Common sense dictates that when those in power are the ones making the rules, playing by the rules will not protect the people from tyranny. Freedom advocates who limit themselves to working within the system, when the system was designed and built by those who crave dominion over others, ultimately have no chance of success. History bears that out in the U.S. and elsewhere. While Americans value their First Amendment rights, the truth is that the ability to complain and protest in and of itself does little or nothing to prevent tyranny. The right on paper to criticize the government did not stop Chinese troops from massacring unarmed protesters in Tiananmen Square. It did not prevent the brutal crushing of all dissent and protest in North Korea. It did not stop Stalin from murdering millions of his critics and political opponents. Whenever there is a contest between the words of dissenters and the guns of government enforcers, tyranny wins and freedom loses. Elections, political action, petitions, and protests are all tactics designed to try to persuade those in power to change their ways, to alter their laws. All such tactics, everything that can be done within the realm of politics, amounts to asking nicely for those with power to show mercy and restraint, and to grant their legislative permission for the people to be free. But tyrants have never been swayed by polite requests for justice and mercy. Indeed, through all of history, little or nothing has been accomplished by those who have begged for justice and appealed to the consciences of those in power. Even those making the most well-reasoned, heartfelt pleas were, at best, simply ignored, and at worst, murdered. No tyrannical regime has ever been ended by people politely asking for justice. In short, the only thing that has ever prevented tyranny has been outright disobedience and resistance. The countless well-meaning individuals who have believed that the moral and civilized way to effect political change is to vote, petition, and beg for reform while continuing to obey the edicts of their rulers have done little or nothing to prevent tyranny. History shows all too clearly that only those capable of contemplating direct disobedience and resistance against their own government have ever actually prevented or ended tyranny. The resistance may be non-violent, as in the case of the movement led by Gandhi in India, or it may be violent, as in the case of the American Revolution. And the methods of disobedience and resistance may vary. For example, the injustice of legally enforced slavery in the United States was undone largely by the Underground Railroad and by jurors refusing to convict defendants prosecuted under fugitive slave laws. But ultimately, because any injustice can be enacted as law, the only thing that has ever prevented tyranny, or even slowed it down significantly, is a people willing to disobey those who wear the label of authority. The subjects of every authoritarian empire are taught that if one disagrees with the law or believes the government's actions to be unjust, the proper civilized response is to obey authority and comply with the law, while humbly asking those in power to change the law. But such an attitude is in direct opposition to the sentiment expressed in the Declaration of Independence, that when any government becomes a violator rather than a protector of individual liberty, the people have the right and the duty to alter or abolish that government. Despite the pride many people feel at being law-abiding citizens, the truth is that only those willing to directly combat injustices done in the name of authority and law have ever been an impediment to the would-be tyrants of the world. But to most Americans today, criticism and protest is seen as proper and noble, but actual disobedience is simply unthinkable. Unfortunately, people with such a mindset pose no obstacle at all to complete totalitarianism. Some hope for liberty and some spirit of resistance is now coming from a seemingly unlikely source: government enforcers. A number of U.S. soldiers and law enforcers have pledged not to participate in disarming the American people, in detaining people without charges, or in other violations of individual rights. Members of the U.S. military all pledge an oath not to serve the politicians, but to protect and defend the Constitution from all enemies, foreign and domestic. Recently, more and more men and women in uniform have been taking that oath seriously. Needless to say, the quickest and least destructive way for a tyrannical agenda to be ended is for the government's own enforcers to refuse to inflict injustice upon the people. But if that does not occur, if the state's enforcers will follow orders without question, then freedom will only survive if the people have not only the will to disobey, but the means to forcibly resist state aggression. Because every government uses force against the disobedient, that leaves the people with only 4 choices: submit and obey, be caged or killed, run and hide, or forcibly resist. The last of which can be done successfully only if the people possess the weaponry needed to combat the violence of the state. It was with that in mind that the Second Amendment was penned. But when it comes to violent conflict, thugs and tyrants have one big advantage. Those who crave power and dominion have no qualms about using violence to impose their will upon others, while peaceful, moral people tend to hesitate to use physical force, even in righteous self-defense. The pages of history books are full of examples of decent people passively cooperating with tyranny, reluctant to even engage in non-violent civil disobedience, much less forcible resistance, and paying for their tolerance, endurance, and patience with their lives. The only people who have ever defeated tyrants are those who were able and willing to disobey the masters. Most of the large-scale injustices of history were inflicted upon people who, for the most part, did not resist, because they had been taught to value obedience to authority above liberty and justice. Only a people with a fundamentally different attitude and mindset should expect a different outcome. As much as some people want to believe in American exceptionalism, want to believe that the US is the freest country on earth, and want to believe that tyranny could never happen here, the facts tell a very different story. The very principles and ideas that prevent tyranny have long since been abandoned and are now ridiculed and hated by nearly everyone in power and by nearly all American voters. Tyranny cannot be forced on a people that understands and believes in individual liberty. Instead, in almost every case, tyranny has been enacted with the blessing and support of the people. Tyrants who rise to power usually do so surrounded by cheering, excited, adoring masses, not because people are malicious or evil, but simply because they are ignorant of history and ignorant of philosophy, and as a result, easily seduced by the empty promises of authoritarian collectivism. Modern Americans are no different. Imagining themselves to be thinking and informed, they are following the same path that so many other empires have followed, the path to subservience, oppression, and ruin. And usually those who follow that path do not see the path they are on until they reach its end. Avoiding that fate cannot be accomplished by tinkering around the edges of a fundamentally authoritarian, collectivist regime. Even most voters recognize that all they are doing is trying to choose the lesser of two evils, yet they dare not do anything else, because the spirit of resistance, the love of real freedom, the respect for unalienable rights has been trained out of the hearts and minds of most Americans. Relative comfort and prosperity has rendered most Americans passive and docile, unwilling and unable to risk what they have to actively resist the injustices they see, when they see them at all. History makes it perfectly clear that there is no document, no system, no election, no political procedure that can prevent tyranny. In the end, the path society will take is determined solely by what resides in the hearts and minds of the people. A population content to perpetually bicker over authoritarian control, each seeking to use government to control and extort his neighbors, to force his values and preferences onto others, will, sooner or later, descend into tyranny. Only a population which understands and loves the concepts of self-ownership and self-determination, only a population that yearns for a world of equals, interacting voluntarily, with no masters and no slaves, with an unflinching and uncompromising loyalty to the principle of individual liberty, can ever know true peace, justice, and freedom. Which road America takes remains to be seen.